When a mountain hermit walked into town that winter morning, he had no idea a woman sitting on store steps would crack open the fortress he'd spent 15 years building. Ethan Crowley, 42 and half wild, had survived grizzlies, blizzards, and loneliness that could break a man's mind. But Clara Voss, 45, broke, and somehow still laughing, would prove more dangerous than all of it. This is the story of two people who'd given up on everything, finding something neither one was looking for. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind came down off the mountains like something with teeth. Ethan Crowley felt it cutting through his coat as he guided his horse down the narrow switchback trail. The kind of cold that made your bones ache even through layers of wool and leather. February in the high country didn't mess around. It killed quietly, efficiently, without drama or warning. He'd found more than one fool frozen solid over the years, still sitting upright against a tree like they'd just decided to take a rest. He'd left his ridge cabin before dawn, when the sky was still that deep purple black that meant the world hadn't quite decided to wake up yet. The ride down took 3 hours if you pushed it, 4 if you had any sense. Ethan took 4. His gelding, a sturdy bay named Tucker, knew the trail better than most people knew their own kitchens. Red Hollow sat in a valley where 3 mountain passes came together, which made it a natural stopping point for anyone heading west or east or just trying not to die in the high country. It wasn't much, maybe 200 souls on a good day, most of them scraped raw by the kind of life that didn't leave much room for softness. Main Street ran 6 blocks, flanked by false front buildings that had seen better decades. The saloon, the general store, a church nobody attended except when someone died, a blacksmith, a boarding house that doubled as a brothel, depending on who you asked. Ethan had lived above Red Hollow for 15 years, and he could count on one hand the number of times he'd spent more than an hour in town. He came down for supplies when he absolutely had to, flour, salt, ammunition, coffee when he could afford it, talked to exactly as many people as necessary to conduct business, then disappeared back up the mountain like smoke. People had stopped trying to make conversation with him around year 3. He hitched Tucker outside Harmon's Dry Goods just after 10 in the morning. The street was quiet, just a few wagons parked at odd angles, a dog sleeping in a patch of weak sunlight. His boots hit the frozen mud with dull thuds as he stepped up onto the boardwalk. That's when he saw her. She was sitting on the steps of the dry goods store, her back against one of the porch posts, hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for something that might never come. Dark hair pulled back severe, threads of gray catching the light. A coat that had once been nice but was now held together with careful stitching and what looked like determination. Her face had lines that meant she'd lived some life, probably more than she'd wanted to. Ethan had developed a talent for not noticing people. It was a survival skill, like knowing which mushrooms would kill you or how to read weather in the shape of clouds. But something about the way she sat there, not slumped, not defeated, just still, caught him wrong-footed. She looked up as he approached the door. Their eyes met for maybe half a second. Hers were gray or maybe green, hard to tell in the flat winter light. They were steady, though, assessing, not asking for anything, just watching. He nodded once, the bare minimum of acknowledgement, and reached for the door handle. "They won't be open for another hour," she said. Her voice surprised him. Educated. Eastern, maybe, or at least somewhere that still believed in grammar. Not the rough frontier drawl most people carried out here. Ethan stopped, hand still on the handle. Sign says 9. Sign's been wrong for 6 months. She didn't move, didn't shift her position. Mr. Harmon's wife is sick. He opens when he can, which lately means 11, maybe noon. He pulled his hand back, annoyed at himself for not noticing the darkened windows, the lack of smoke from the stovepipe, getting sloppy. Time alone did that to a man, made him forget to pay attention to details that mattered. "Right," he said. He should have walked away then. Should have untied Tucker, ridden back up the mountain, come back another day. That's what the old Ethan would have done. The one who'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of being alone. Instead, he heard himself say, "You waiting for someone?" She smiled just a little. It didn't reach her eyes. "Not specifically." "You hungry?" The words were out before he'd thought them through, and they hung in the cold air between them like something alive and unexpected. He watched her face change, surprise flickering across it. Then something that might have been amusement, then a careful blankness that told him she'd learned to be suspicious of kindness. "That's very kind of you," she said, in a tone that wasn't accepting or refusing, just acknowledging the offer existed. "There's a place down the street. Coffee's terrible, but the biscuits are decent." She looked at him for a long moment, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not attraction exactly, or not just that. More like recognition, like looking at another survivor of some unnamed war, someone who'd learned the same hard lessons about what the world took from you if you weren't careful. "I don't take charity," she said finally. "Didn't offer any. Offered coffee and biscuits." "What's the difference?" "Charity's about feeling good about yourself. Coffee's just coffee." She laughed then, and the sound of it hit him like a physical thing. It was real, unexpected, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere genuine instead of polite. It changed her whole face, made her look younger and older at the same time, like whatever she'd been through hadn't quite managed to kill the part of her that could still find something funny. "All right," she said, standing up with the careful movements of someone whose joints didn't work quite like they used to. "I could use some terrible coffee." The Blue Canyon Cafe sat halfway down Main Street, wedged between a hardware store and an abandoned building that used to be a lawyer's office. The windows were steamed up from the inside, and the smell of bacon grease and burnt chicory coffee hit you before you even opened the door. Ethan held it for her, another gesture from some buried part of himself he thought he'd killed off years ago. She walked in ahead of him, scanning the room with the same careful assessment she'd given him earlier. It was mostly empty. A couple of miners nursing coffee at the counter, an old man working on a plate of eggs in the corner. The owner, a woman named Beth, who'd run the place for as long as anyone could remember, looked up from wiping down a table and raised an eyebrow at seeing Ethan with someone. "Corner booth all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. They sat across from each other on cracked vinyl seats that had been patched with different colored tape over the years. Beth came over with 2 cups and a pot of coffee that looked like it had been sitting on the burner since yesterday. "Biscuits?" she asked, looking between them with undisguised curiosity. 2 plates, Ethan said. "Make it 1, the woman said. "I'm not that hungry." 2 plates, Ethan repeated, meeting Beth's eyes. "And gravy, if you've got it." Beth shrugged and walked away, already composing the story she'd tell later about Ethan Crowley buying breakfast for a strange woman. They sat in silence while the coffee cooled to something drinkable. Ethan had forgotten how awkward it was, sitting across from another person, trying to figure out what you were supposed to say. Up on the ridge, conversations were simple. Him and Tucker, mostly one-sided. Or him and himself, which was even easier because he already knew how all those arguments would end. "I'm Clara," she said finally. "Clara Voss." "Ethan." "Just Ethan?" "Crowley. Ethan Crowley." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup like she was trying to steal its warmth. Her fingers were long, elegant despite the rough patches and broken nails. Hands that had done work they weren't originally designed for. "You live around here, Ethan Crowley?" "Up on Thompson Ridge." "That's the one that's always got snow on it?" "That's the one." "Long way to come for coffee." "Needed supplies." She smiled again, that same quick flash that seemed to surprise her as much as him. "And you decided to buy breakfast for a stranger while you waited." Seemed like the thing to do. "Why?" The question was direct, no games. He appreciated that. Too many people talked around what they really wanted to say, like the truth was something fragile that might break if you touched it directly. "Don't know," he said, which was honest. "You looked like you'd been sitting there a while." 3 hours. "That's a long time to wait for a store to open." "I wasn't waiting for the store." Beth returned with 2 plates piled with biscuits swimming in white gravy. She set them down with more force than necessary, clearly annoyed that neither of them seemed inclined to provide any interesting information. Clara looked at the food like it was some kind of puzzle she needed to solve. "Go on," Ethan said. "It won't kill you, probably." She picked up her fork, cut a small piece of biscuit, tasted it carefully. Then her eyes closed for just a second, and he saw her shoulders drop about an inch. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked. "Yesterday, day before maybe. I lose track." Jesus. Don't, she said, eyes opening. Don't do that thing where you get all concerned and noble. I'm fine. I've been hungrier. That's supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to make you mind your own business. But she kept eating, methodical and steady, like someone who'd learned not to waste food. Ethan worked on his own plate, sneaking glances at her between bites. She was older than he'd first thought, mid-40s probably, though it was hard to tell. Life out here aged people in strange ways. Some people looked ancient at 30. Others seemed to have made some deal with time itself, staying hard and lean while years piled up behind them. Clara looked tired. Not the temporary tired of a bad night's sleep, but the deep exhaustion that came from fighting too long against things you couldn't change. "You new in town?" he asked. "Got in 4 days ago." "From where?" "East. Denver before that. St. Louis before that. Boston originally, about 100 years ago." "That's a lot of befores." "I've had a lot of lives." She set down her fork, most of the biscuit gone. "This one's looking pretty sparse so far." "What brings you to Red Hollow? Most people are trying to get out, not in." "Ran out of road, ran out of money, ran out of options, frankly. Heard they might need help at the assay office, someone who could keep books." You know numbers?" "I know numbers better than I know people, which hasn't always served me well." Ethan almost smiled at that. "Assay office won't hire you." "Why not?" "Thompson runs it. He's got his nephew doing the books, has for years. Won't fire family, even if the boy can't count past 10 without taking off his boots." Claire's face didn't change, but something in her eyes went flat. Not surprised, just confirmed in whatever she'd already suspected about how the world worked. "Of course he does," she said quietly. "But Henderson's feed might need someone. Old man Henderson's going blind, can't see the ledgers anymore. His daughter's been trying to manage it, but she's got 6 kids and a husband who drinks. They're drowning in paperwork." "You seem to know a lot about people for someone who lives on a mountain alone." "Small town, news travels. Even if you're not asking for it." She studied him across the table, and Ethan had the uncomfortable feeling of being read like one of those ledgers she apparently understood so well. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Who says I'm helping?" "You bought me breakfast, told me where to find work. That's more than anyone else has done in 4 days. Maybe I just don't like seeing people go hungry." "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's something else. You look like a man who spent a long time not caring about other people's problems. So what changed in the last 20 minutes?" It was a fair question. Ethan didn't have a good answer for it. "Your laugh," he said finally. "My laugh?" "When I mentioned the coffee. You laughed like you meant it. Not many people do that." Clara went very still, and for a second he thought he'd said something wrong, crossed some line he didn't know existed. Then she looked down at her empty plate, and when she looked back up, there was something fierce in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I've got nothing left to lose," she said. "So yeah, I laugh when something's funny. I cry when it hurts. I say what I mean because there's no point in lying anymore. That bother you?" "No," Ethan said. "That doesn't bother me at all." They sat there for another minute, not talking, just existing in the same space while the cafe filled up around them with the late morning crowd. Beth kept glancing over, clearly dying to know what was happening at the corner booth. Finally, Clara stood up. "I should go find Henderson's feed before someone else takes the job. Turn left out the door, 3 blocks down. Brown building with the wagon wheel out front. Thank you for breakfast, Ethan Crowley. It was just biscuits." "It was more than that, and we both know it." She walked out without looking back, and Ethan sat there feeling like something had just happened that he wasn't quite equipped to understand. He finished his coffee, left money on the table for both plates even though she'd barely touched hers, and headed back out into the cold. Tucker was still tied where he'd left him, patient as stone. Ethan untied the reins, but instead of mounting up, he found himself walking down Main Street in the direction Clara had gone. He told himself he was just killing time until Harmon's opened, that he wanted to make sure she actually found the feed store, that it was no big deal, just basic human decency, the kind of thing anyone would do. But the truth he didn't want to look at too closely, was that for the first time in 15 years, he was curious about another person. Not just what they needed or what they wanted, but who they were underneath all the defensive layers and survival instincts. And that scared him more than any blizzard or grizzly ever had. Cool. Henderson's feed and supply was easy to spot, just like Ethan had said. Brown clapboard building with a wagon wheel leaning against the front wall, paint flaking off in long curls. Clara stood outside for a moment, straightening her coat, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Ethan watched from across the street, feeling ridiculous and unable to stop himself. She went inside. He counted to 30, then crossed the street and pushed through the door behind her. A bell jangled overhead, announcing his presence. The store smelled like grain dust and leather and the particular mustiness of a place that had been around forever. Clara was already at the counter, talking to a girl who couldn't have been more than 25. Henderson's daughter, probably. The girl looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a messy knot. Really good with numbers, Clara was saying. I managed accounts for a shipping company in Denver. Before that, I kept books for a hotel in St. Louis. I can provide references if... Can you start today? The girl interrupted. Clara blinked. Today? Right now, actually. I've got 3 ledgers that don't balance, a shipment coming in this afternoon that I need to inventory, and my youngest has croup, so I need to get home. If you can add and subtract and write clearly, you're hired. I can do all of that. Wages are 30 cents a day, 6 days a week. We're open dawn to dusk. You get Sunday off and an hour for dinner. That's very fair. It's terrible, but it's what we can afford. You want the job or not? Yes, Clara said, and Ethan could hear the relief in her voice even from where he stood near the door. Yes, I want the job. The girl, her name was Mary, Ethan remembered now, sagged against the counter like a puppet with cut strings. Oh, thank the Lord. The ledgers are in the back office. I'll show you where everything is. The filing system doesn't make any sense because my father invented it and he won't explain it to anyone. But you seem smart. You'll figure it out. She finally noticed Ethan standing there. Help you with something? Just looking, he said, which was obviously a lie since he hadn't moved from the doorway. Mary shrugged, too tired to care, and led Clara toward the back of the store. Clara glanced back once, caught Ethan's eye, and gave him a small nod that might have been acknowledgement or gratitude or just recognition that he was still there. He left before they came back out. Harmon's was open by the time Ethan returned to the dry goods store. He bought what he needed: flour, salt, ammunition, a new whetstone because his was wearing down to nothing. Harmon tried to make conversation about the weather and the price of beef and whether the pass would be clear by March, but Ethan gave him one-word answers until the man gave up and just tallied the bill. Saw you at the cafe earlier, Harmon said as he wrapped the purchases in brown paper. With that new woman. Yep. She looking for work? Found some. Over at Henderson's. Huh. Harmon tied the package with string, his movements practiced and efficient. She seems a bit refined for Red Hollow. Wonder what her story is. Didn't ask. Course you didn't. Harmon handed over the package. That'll be $4.30. Ethan counted out the money, picked up his supplies, and headed for the door. Ethan, Harmon called after him. He stopped, turned. It's good to see you talking to someone. Been a long time. Ethan didn't answer, just walked out into the cold. He tied the supplies to Tucker's saddle, checking the knots twice to make sure nothing would shift on the ride back up. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of snow that wasn't quite ready to fall yet. He should leave. Should ride back up to the ridge, back to his cabin and his solitude and his careful routines that kept the world at a safe distance. But he found himself walking back down Main Street one more time. Henderson's had a window that looked in on the main floor. Through it, Ethan could see Clara at a desk in the back corner, already bent over a ledger, her face serious with concentration. As he watched, she made a note, flipped back several pages, compared 2 columns of numbers, and made another note. Mary was showing her something, gesturing at different parts of the office. Clara nodded, asked a question Ethan couldn't hear through the glass. Mary answered, looking relieved to be talking to someone who seemed to understand what she was dealing with. Ethan stood there longer than he should have, just watching Clara work. There was something about the way she moved, efficient, purposeful, like every gesture had been calculated to waste as little energy as possible. like someone who'd learned to conserve everything because you never knew when you'd need reserves. Finally, he forced himself to walk away. The ride back up the mountain took longer than usual. Tucker sensed his distraction, kept having to correct his own footing because Ethan wasn't guiding him properly. The trail wound up through stands of pine and aspen, bare branches scraping against the gray sky. By the time Ethan reached his cabin, the sun was already thinking about setting, turning the western clouds the color of old blood. The cabin sat in a small clearing on the eastern face of Thompson Ridge, positioned to catch the morning light and avoid the worst of the western winds. It wasn't much. One room, maybe 20 feet square, with a sleeping loft and a stone fireplace that Ethan had built himself. Chimney needed work, he noticed as he dismounted. Always needed work. He unsaddled Tucker, rubbed him down, made sure he had hay and water in the lean-to shelter. Then he carried his supplies inside and stood in the doorway, looking at the space like he was seeing it for the first time. It was clean. He'd give himself that. Neat. Everything in its place because there wasn't room for chaos when you lived this far from help. But it was also empty in a way that suddenly felt deliberate. No pictures on the walls, no books except a Bible he never read, and an almanac from 6 years ago. No music, no decoration, nothing that wasn't strictly necessary for survival. He'd built a cell, he realized. A very comfortable cell, but a cell nonetheless. The fire had gone out while he was gone. He rebuilt it, going through the familiar motions, kindling, larger sticks, logs arranged in a careful structure that would catch and hold. The flames spread slowly, pushing back the cold. He made coffee, the real stuff he'd bought in town, not the chicory mix he usually settled for. It tasted better than it had any right to, and he couldn't decide if that was because it was higher quality or because it reminded him of sitting across from Clara in the cafe. Outside, the wind picked up, making the pine trees whisper and moan. It was going to snow tonight. He could feel it in his bones. Heavy snow, the kind that would pile up fast and make the trail down impassable for a few days. Good, he thought. Time alone to clear his head, remember who he was and why he'd chosen this life. But even as he thought it, he found himself wondering if Clara had found a place to stay, if Henderson's daughter had thought to tell her about the boarding house, or if she was still sitting somewhere cold, counting what little money she had and trying to make it stretch another day. Not your problem, he said out loud to the empty cabin. The fire crackled its response, which could have meant anything. Ishab. 3 days later, the snow stopped, and Ethan rode back down to Red Hollow. He told himself it was because he'd forgotten to buy lamp oil, which was true, but also something he could have done without for another week. He told himself the trail would be bad if he waited any longer, which was also true, but not nearly as compelling as he wanted it to be. The real reason, the one he didn't want to examine too closely, was that he'd spent 3 days thinking about Clara Voss and her unexpected laugh and the way she'd looked at him like he was a puzzle worth solving. Main Street was churned mud and ice, the fresh snow already trampled by horses and wagon wheels. Ethan tied Tucker outside the general store, having actually forgotten lamp oil made as good a cover as any, and then found himself walking toward Henderson's feed. Through the window, he could see Clara at the same desk, working with the same focused intensity. But something was different. Mary was sitting next to her, and they were both laughing at something, their heads bent close over a ledger. Ethan pushed open the door. Clara looked up, and her face did something complicated. Surprise, then pleasure, then a careful neutrality that told him she was trying not to show how pleased she was. "Ethan Crowley," she said. "Forget something in town?" "Lamp oil." "That's next door." "I know where it is." Mary looked between them with poorly concealed interest. "I'm going to go check on that shipment in the back," she announced, standing up too quickly and nearly knocking over her chair. "You don't have to—" Clara started. "Yes, I do. It's very important, extremely urgent." Mary practically fled toward the storage room. Clara shook her head, but she was smiling. Subtle. "Small town," Ethan said. "Entertainment's hard to come by." "Apparently I'm this week's scandal. Woman of mystery appears from nowhere. Mountain hermit buys her breakfast. People are speculating." "About what?" "Whether I'm your secret wife. Whether you've gone soft. Whether I'm running from the law." She tilted her head, studying him. "Are those the kind of questions you came back to ask?" "No." "What did you come back for?" Good question. Ethan didn't have a good answer, or at least not one he was ready to say out loud. Wanted to see if you got the job, he said finally. You saw me get the job. You were standing outside the window like some kind of strange guardian angel. You saw me? Reflection in the glass. You're not as sneaky as you think. Ethan felt heat creep up his neck, which was ridiculous. He was 42 years old. He didn't blush. How's it going? He asked, changing the subject. The job? It's a mess. Beautiful, complicated mess. Henderson's filing system is actually brilliant once you understand it, but his daughter couldn't see the pattern. The books haven't balanced in 8 months, not because of theft, but because someone, probably the nephew who's supposedly good with numbers, has been categorizing things wrong. She was animated now, her hands moving as she talked, and Ethan found himself fascinated by the transformation. This was someone in her element, doing something she was good at, and it showed in every gesture. I found about $600 in discrepancies so far, she continued. Money that's there but wasn't being counted right. Mary almost cried when I showed her. She thought they were going under. You did that in 3 days? I did that in 2 days. Today I'm teaching Mary how to maintain it so she won't need me forever. She's lucky to have you. Clara's smile faded a little. She's paying me wages, that's all it is. Is it? What else would it be? Sounds like you actually give a damn whether their business survives. Well, she looked down at the ledger, running her finger along a column of numbers. She's got 6 kids and a drunk husband, and she's been trying to hold this whole thing together by herself. I know what that's like, fighting alone. There it was again, that glimpse into whatever Clara had survived before washing up in Red Hollow. Ethan wanted to ask, wanted to know the whole story, but he could see the walls going up behind her eyes. You find a place to stay? He asked instead. Boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher gave me a room on credit until I get paid Friday. It's got a bed and a window that closes most of the way. That's more than I had a week ago. That's not much of a standard. I've learned to be grateful for small things. She closed the ledger, set down her pencil. Why are you really here, Ethan? Don't know, he admitted. Can't seem to stay away. That's honest. Seemed easier than lying. Most things are. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. I'm about to take my dinner break. Walk with me? It wasn't really a question, and Ethan found himself nodding before he'd thought it through. They walked down Main Street together, not quite side by side, but close enough that their arms almost touched. People watched, of course. Ethan could feel eyes tracking them from windows and doorways, could imagine the conversations that would happen once they passed. You're making me a very interesting person in this town, Clara said, like she could read his thoughts. I've been here less than a week, and everyone already knows who I am. Sorry about that. Don't be. It's better than being invisible. She pulled her coat tighter as the wind picked up. Where I came from, I spent 2 years being invisible. This is an improvement. They ended up at the cafe again, like it was the only place in town either of them knew to go. Beth raised both eyebrows when they walked in together, but didn't comment, just poured coffee and left them alone in the same corner booth as before. Tell me about your mountain, Clara said, wrapping her hands around the cup. Not much to tell. It's a mountain, trees, rocks, snow 6 months a year. Why do you live up there? Peace and quiet. No. She shook her head. That's what you tell people who ask casual questions. I'm not asking casual questions. Ethan looked at her across the table. This woman he'd known for less than a week, who somehow felt like she could see through every defense he'd spent 15 years building. My wife died, he said. 15 years ago. Fever took her over 3 days. I couldn't do anything, couldn't save her, couldn't even make it less painful. When it was over, I looked around at our house in town and realized I couldn't stand to be in it anymore. Every corner reminded me of her. Every person who offered sympathy felt like they were rubbing salt in something that wouldn't heal. So you ran. So I left. Found a ridge nobody else wanted, built a cabin, learned to be alone. Did it work? For a while. Maybe still does, I don't know anymore. Clara was quiet, turning her cup in slow circles on the table. I was married too, she said finally, to a man who seemed like everything I was supposed to want. Wealthy, respected, charming when he wanted to be. We lived in Boston, had a beautiful house, beautiful life. What happened? He made bad investments, gambled, borrowed money from the wrong people using my inheritance as collateral. When it all fell apart, he disappeared. Left me with debts I couldn't pay and property I didn't own, and his creditors knocking on my door. Her voice was calm, factual, like she was reading someone else's story. I lost everything. The house, my reputation, my future. Everything I thought was mine turned out to belong to someone else. Jesus, Clara. Don't. She met his eyes. Don't pity me. I survived it. Learned to keep books so I could work. Learned to move when a place got too expensive. Learned to tell the difference between kindness and manipulation. I'm harder than I look. I can see that. Can you? She leaned forward slightly. Because that's why I'm here, Ethan. In this town, in this booth, talking to you. I'm too old and too tired to pretend anymore. If you're looking for someone soft and grateful and easy to fix, I'm not that person. Good, Ethan said. Because I'm too old and too tired to be someone's salvation. They looked at each other across the table, and something settled between them. An understanding, maybe. A recognition that they were both people who'd been broken by life and put themselves back together in ways that didn't quite match the original design. So what do we do? Clara asked. About what? About this. Whatever this is. Ethan didn't have an answer. He'd spent 15 years deliberately not having these kinds of questions in his life. I don't know, he said. Maybe we just keep having coffee and see what happens. Clara smiled, that real smile that had hooked him the first time. That might be the sanest thing anyone said to me in years. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, watching the street through the steamed-up windows. When they finally stood to leave, Ethan caught himself wanting to take her hand, wanting to close that small distance between them. He didn't. But the wanting itself was enough to tell him that something had changed, something he couldn't take back even if he wanted to. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying the promise of more snow. I should get back, Clara said. Mary's probably drowning in that shipment by now. I should head up before the weather turns. Will I see you again? The question was casual, but Ethan heard the weight underneath it. The vulnerability of asking, of admitting she wanted something instead of just surviving whatever came. Yeah, he said. You'll see me again. When? Soon. That's not very specific. It's what I've got. She laughed, shook her head. Fair enough. Go on. Get back to your mountain before you freeze to death on the trail. He watched her walk back toward Henderson's, her figure getting smaller against the gray buildings and grayer sky. Then he untied Tucker and started the long ride home. The snow started an hour into the ride, fat flakes that stuck to everything they touched. By the time Ethan reached his cabin, the whole world was white and quiet and empty. But for the first time in 15 years, the emptiness bothered him. He stood in his doorway, looking at his neat, sparse room, and thought about Clara bent over ledgers in a warm store. Clara laughing at something Mary said. Clara asking him questions like his answers mattered. The fire had gone out again. He'd need to rebuild it, boil water for dinner, tend to Tucker, do all the small tasks that made up his solitary life. But first, he let himself stand there in the cold, holding on to the memory of sitting across from someone who looked at him like he was still a person worth knowing. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had in a very long time. And despite everything he'd learned about safety and distance and keeping the world at arm's length, Ethan Crowley found himself hoping it would be enough to build on. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing the trail back to town, erasing everything except the moment and the memory and the strange, uncomfortable feeling of wanting something he'd thought he'd given up years ago. The possibility of not being alone, the risk of trying again, the terrifying, exhilarating chance that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to let someone in. The next 2 weeks fell into a pattern Ethan didn't quite know how to name. He'd ride down from the ridge every 3 or 4 days, always with some excuse that sounded reasonable enough. Needed nails for the roof repair, wanted to check on Tucker's shoes, thought he'd pick up some tobacco even though he'd quit smoking 7 years ago. Each time he'd find himself drifting toward Henderson's feed, and each time Clara would look up from whatever ledger she was working on with that small smile that never quite reached her eyes, but got a little closer every time. They'd have coffee. Sometimes they'd talk, sometimes they wouldn't. The silence between them started feeling less awkward and more like something they both understood. Two people who'd gotten used to their own company learning to share space again. The town noticed, of course. Red Hollow was too small and too bored for them not to. Ethan was loading supplies into Tucker's saddlebags one afternoon when Harmon came out of his store, wiping his hands on his apron. "So you're spending more time in town these days," Harmon said, trying to sound casual and failing completely. "Needed supplies. Needed supplies 4 times in 2 weeks? Must be going through flour awful fast up there." Ethan tightened a strap harder than necessary. "Weather's been good for traveling. Weather's been terrible. We had 3 feet of snow last Tuesday. Mountain weather's different." Harmon laughed, not unkindly. "Sure it is. Look, I'm not trying to pry, just saying it's good to see you coming around more. And that Voss woman seems decent enough for all the mystery around her." "There's no mystery. She needed work. She found work." "Right. And you just happen to be in town every time she takes her dinner break." Ethan mounted Tucker without answering, but Harmon wasn't finished. "Mary Henderson says Clara's been asking about you," he called up. "Careful questions, like she's trying to figure something out." "What kind of questions?" "How long you've been up on that ridge, whether you ever come down for anything besides supplies, if you've got family anywhere." Harmon grinned. "She's doing what you're doing, circling around trying to get the measure of something without admitting that's what she's doing." "You done?" "For now. But Ethan, whatever you two are figuring out, don't take 15 years doing it. Life's too short, and this town needs something to celebrate besides funerals and failed crops." Ethan rode off before Harmon could say anything else, but the words stuck with him on the way back up the mountain. The old man wasn't wrong. He was circling, had been since that first morning on the store steps. The question was what he planned to do when he finally got to the center. That night, alone in his cabin with the wind screaming outside, Ethan pulled out a box from under his bed that he hadn't opened in years. Inside were the few things he'd kept from his marriage: a photograph of Sarah, some letters, her wedding ring. He looked at the photograph for a long time, studying her face like he might find answers there. She'd been 23 when they married, 26 when she died. Beautiful in that fragile way some women had, all delicate bones and quick smiles. She'd wanted children, a bigger house, maybe a move to Denver someday where there were more opportunities. None of it had happened. The fever had seen to that. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said to the photograph, feeling foolish but needing to say it anyway. "I met someone. She's nothing like you. Older, harder, been through hell from the sound of it, but there's something about her that won't let go." The photograph didn't answer, of course. Ethan put it back in the box, slid the box back under the bed, and tried not to think about what it meant that he could look at Sarah's face now without feeling like his chest was caving in. Maybe that was progress. Or maybe it was betrayal. He honestly couldn't tell anymore. 3 days later, he rode back down during the worst storm of the season. Tucker fought him the whole way, trying to turn back. But Ethan pushed forward through snow that was coming down so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. He knew it was stupid, knew he should have stayed put, waited it out like any sensible person would. But something had been gnawing at him since Harmon's comment about Clara asking questions, and the storm gave him cover to act on it without having to examine his reasons too closely. By the time he reached Red Hollow, both he and Tucker were coated in ice, and Ethan had lost feeling in his feet. He tied the horse under the overhang at Henderson's and stumbled inside, snow cascading off his coat onto the floor. Mary looked up from the counter, eyes going wide. "Ethan, what are you doing here in this weather?" "Needed—" He stopped, realizing he hadn't actually thought of an excuse. "Is Clara here?" "In the back office. Are you insane? That trail's going to be impassable by nightfall." "Probably." Mary shook her head but gestured toward the office. "Go on. I'm not getting in the middle of whatever this is." Clara was bent over a ledger, pencil moving in quick strokes. She looked up when his shadow fell across her desk, and her expression went from surprise to concern in about half a second. "You're frozen," she said, standing quickly. "What happened?" "Nothing. Just rode down." "In this?" She gestured at the window, where snow was piling up against the glass. "Are you trying to kill yourself?" "Needed to see you." The words came out before he could stop them, honest and raw and completely undefended. Clara went very still, her hand frozen halfway to reaching for him. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Don't know. Can't explain it. Just needed to make sure you were all right." "All right?" She laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Ethan, I'm fine. I'm sitting in a warm office doing bookkeeping. You're the one who just rode down a mountain in a blizzard for no reason." There was a reason. What reason? He couldn't answer that. Didn't have words for the tight feeling in his chest that had been building for days. The sense that if he didn't see her soon, something important would slip away. Clara studied his face, and whatever she saw there made her expression soften. "Come on," she said. "Let's get you warm before you lose any toes." She led him to a storage room in the back where Henderson kept a small stove going to keep the animal feed from freezing. There was a chair, some old blankets, a box that could serve as a table. Clara pushed Ethan into the chair and started peeling off his wet coat. "I can do that," he protested. "Shut up and let me help." Her hands were efficient, impersonal, removing layers until she could see the extent of the damage. His fingers were white and bloodless, his lips probably blue. She wrapped him in blankets, then knelt to pull off his boots. "Can you feel your feet?" "Not really." "That's bad." She rubbed his feet through his socks, trying to restore circulation. "You could have died up there. You know that, right?" "Wasn't planning on dying." "Well, that makes it all better then." But her hands kept working, gentle despite her sharp tone. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking I hadn't seen you in 3 days, and I needed to know you were all right." Clara stopped rubbing, looked up at him. "Why wouldn't I be all right?" "I don't know. Maybe you got fired. Maybe you couldn't pay your rent. Maybe you got tired of this nowhere town and moved on." He knew he sounded irrational, maybe a little desperate, but the storm and the cold had stripped away his ability to pretend. "Maybe I just needed to see your face." She sat back on her heels, still holding his feet. "You're going to have to stay in town tonight. That trail's suicide in the dark." "I know." "Mrs. Fletcher might have a room." "Clara." "What?" "Stop avoiding what I just said." She looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she stood, brushed off her skirt, and sat down on the box across from him. "I'm scared," she said finally. "Of what?" "Of this. Of you. Of the fact that I've been in this town less than a month and I'm already starting to count the days between when you ride down. That's not safe, Ethan. I can't afford to depend on anyone." "I'm not asking you to depend on me." "Aren't you? You just risked your life to check on me. That's not casual. That's not just coffee and conversation." She was right, and they both knew it. Ethan could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. He could back away now, make some excuse about the storm making him stupid, retreat to his mountain in his safe isolation. Or he could lean in. "No," he said. "It's not casual. I don't know what it is, but it's not that." "I'm 45 years old," Clara said, and there was something fierce in her voice. "I've been married, been poor, been desperate. I've made every mistake you can make and probably invented a few new ones. I don't have anything to offer you except bad history and good bookkeeping skills." "That's not true." "What do I have then? Tell me." Ethan thought about the question, really thought about it. "You have that laugh," he said finally. "The real one, not the polite one. You have the way you look at problems like they're puzzles instead of disasters. You have the fact that you're still standing after everything that tried to knock you down. That's more than most people have." Claire's eyes were suspiciously bright. "You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you eat like someone who's been hungry. I know you're teaching Mary to keep books, even though you could have just kept the knowledge to yourself and made yourself indispensable. I know you wear the same dress every day because it's the only one you've got, but you keep it clean and mended like it matters. You're paying attention to my clothes. I'm paying attention to everything about you. Can't seem to help it." She stood up abruptly, walked to the small window, looked out at the storm. Ethan watched her shoulders rise and fall with deep breaths, watched her fighting some internal battle he couldn't see. "I left Boston with nothing," she said, not turning around. "Literally nothing. The clothes on my back and $30 I'd hidden from my husband's creditors. I worked my way west, taking whatever jobs I could find. Bookkeeper, seamstress, cook, anything that paid. In Denver, I worked for a shipping company run by a man who seemed kind. He offered me a manager position, said I had a real talent for organization. She paused, and Ethan waited. After 6 months, he tried to force himself on me. When I fought back, he had me arrested for theft, claimed I'd been skimming from the accounts. It was my word against his, and who's going to believe a woman with no references against a respected businessman? Jesus, Clara. I got out of jail after 3 days when a lawyer, a good one, surprisingly, proved the books didn't match the accusation. But the damage was done. No one would hire me in Denver, so I moved to the next town, and the next, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the past to catch up. She turned then, and her face was completely composed, like she was reciting someone else's story. That's what you're getting mixed up with, Ethan. I'm not some romantic figure. I'm a woman who's been used and discarded and accused of crimes I didn't commit. I'm damaged goods in every sense that matters. You done? Ethan asked. She blinked. What? You done trying to scare me off? I'm not trying to scare you. I'm telling you the truth. Good. Because here's my truth. He stood up, blanket falling away, and crossed to where she stood. I've been alone for 15 years. Not just physically alone. I mean alone in every way that counts. I stopped feeling things, stopped wanting things, stopped believing there was any point to anything except surviving one more day. Then I saw you on those steps, and something woke up that I thought was dead. Clara was shaking her head. That's not love, Ethan. That's loneliness. Maybe. Probably. I don't know the difference anymore. But I know that when I'm up on that ridge now, all I think about is riding back down. I know that coffee tastes better when I'm drinking it across from you. I know that for the first time since Sarah died, I can imagine a future that isn't just an endless repeat of the same empty days. Sarah was your wife. Yeah. You loved her. I did. Still do in a way. But she's gone, Clara. Has been for 15 years, and I'm tired of living like I'm gone too. They stood there in the small storage room with the stove ticking and the storm raging outside, so close Ethan could see the pulse beating in Clara's throat. I can't promise you anything, she said finally. I don't know how to be what someone needs. I'm not asking for promises. I'm just asking you not to run. What if I mess this up? What if I'm too broken to do this right? Then we'll both be broken together. Seems fair. Clara laughed, that real laugh he'd been waiting to hear, and it was even better than he remembered. You're insane. Probably. Still want to see where this goes? She looked at him for a long time, and Ethan could see her weighing options, calculating risks, trying to protect herself from one more disappointment. Then something in her face shifted, like a decision being made. Yeah, she said quietly. Yeah, I do. Ethan wanted to kiss her, wanted it badly enough that his hands actually moved toward her face before he caught himself. But something told him that would be too much, too fast. Clara had been used by too many people for him to add himself to that list, even with the best intentions. Instead, he stepped back, giving her space. You're staying at Mrs. Fletcher's? He asked. Room 12. I'll get a room there too. Storm should pass by morning. And then? Then I ride home. Come back down in a few days. We have coffee. Keep doing what we're doing. That's it? For now, unless you want something different. Clara smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. No, that sounds about right. Mary appeared in the doorway, looking between them with barely concealed curiosity. Sorry to interrupt, but we're closing up. Storm's getting worse, and I need to get home. Right, Clara said, suddenly businesslike again. I'll finish those invoices tomorrow. They walked out together into the storm, Ethan leading Tucker toward the boarding house while Clara walked beside him, both of them leaning into the wind. The streets were empty, everyone sensible already inside. Mrs. Fletcher gave them knowing looks when they arrived together, but had the grace not to comment. She had one room left, right next to Clara's. Course she does, Clara muttered, and Ethan had to hide a smile. They stood in the hallway outside their respective doors, neither quite ready to say goodnight. Thank you, Clara said, for riding down in that storm, even if it was stupid. Thanks for not letting me lose any toes. They're nice toes. Would have been a shame. You haven't seen my toes. I was speaking hypothetically. She was smiling again, tired but genuine. Get some sleep, Ethan. We'll talk tomorrow. Looking forward to it. He watched her go into her room, heard the lock click. Then he went into his own room and sat on the bed, listening to the storm and the sounds of Clara moving around next door. It wasn't much. A conversation in a storage room, a walk through a blizzard, 2 rooms in a boarding house separated by a thin wall. But it felt like something shifting, like a door opening that had been locked for a very long time. Ethan lay down without undressing, too tired to do more than pull off his boots. Through the wall, he could hear Clara settling in for the night. Footsteps, the creak of bed springs, the rustle of fabric. He thought about Sarah again, but this time without the familiar weight of grief. If she could see him now, what would she think? Would she be angry that he was moving on, or relieved that he'd finally stopped punishing himself? He'd never know. The dead didn't give answers, no matter how many questions you asked them. What he did know was that Clara Voss was in the next room, alive and complicated and damaged in all the ways that matched his own damage. And for the first time in 15 years, that felt like enough. The storm blew itself out sometime before dawn. Ethan woke to silence and pale light filtering through the window. He dressed quietly, went downstairs to find Mrs. Fletcher already making coffee in the kitchen. "Your lady friend's still sleeping," she said without preamble. "Heard you two talking through the walls last night. Glad you kept it decent." "We just talked." "I know, that's why I'm making you coffee instead of asking you to leave." She poured him a cup. "She's good people, that Clara. Had some hard times, you can tell. Doesn't complain, pays her rent on time, helps with dishes even though she doesn't have to." She mentioned where she came from. "Boston originally, lost everything to a bad husband, been working her way west ever since. That's all I know, and it's all I need to know. Past is past." Ethan drank his coffee, thinking about all the things Clara had told him, and all the things she probably hadn't. She's stronger than she looks. "Oh, I know that. Question is, are you strong enough to match her?" "Don't know yet." "Well, you better figure it out, because that woman's been let down by enough people. She doesn't need another one." It was a warning, gentle but clear. Ethan nodded his understanding. Clara came down about 20 minutes later, looking tired but composed. She'd braided her hair, put on the same dress she always wore, carried herself like she was ready for whatever the day brought. "Morning," she said, accepting coffee from Mrs. Fletcher. "Morning. Storm cleared. I noticed. You heading back up?" "In a bit. Wanted to make sure the trail was safe first." They drank their coffee in the boarding house kitchen while Mrs. Fletcher bustled around, pretending not to listen but clearly taking in every word. "When will I see you again?" Clara asked, and this time the question didn't sound scared, just practical. "Few days. Need to check my traps, make sure the cabin weathered the storm, then I'll come back down. For supplies. And other things." She smiled into her coffee cup. "Other things, very specific. I'm working on being less vague. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." That simple statement hit Ethan harder than it should have. Clara wasn't going anywhere. She'd found a job, a room, maybe even the beginning of a life in Red Hollow. She was staying. He finished his coffee, stood to leave. Clara walked him to the door, and this time when they stood close, she reached out and straightened his collar, her fingers brushing his neck. "Be careful on that trail," she said. "I'd hate to have wasted all that effort keeping your toes attached." "I'll be careful." Good. He wanted to say more, wanted to put into words what was happening between them, but Clara seemed to understand. She squeezed his arm once, then stepped back. "Go on. Tucker's probably frozen to the hitching post by now." Ethan rode out of Red Hollow with the sun climbing higher, turning the new snow into something that hurt to look at. The trail was treacherous, ice hidden under fresh powder, but Tucker navigated it with the steady confidence of a horse who'd made the journey too many times to be impressed by a little weather. Halfway up, Ethan stopped and looked back at the town spread out below. Somewhere down there, Clara was probably back at Henderson's, working on ledgers, teaching Mary new organizational systems, building a life one careful step at a time. And he was riding back to an empty cabin that suddenly felt more like a choice than a sentence. That was progress. That was something. The next week passed in a blur of routine work, checking traps, repairing storm damage, splitting wood for the fire. But underneath the familiar tasks, Ethan could feel something different, an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. He caught himself planning conversations, thinking about things he wanted to tell Clara, questions he wanted to ask. When he rode back down 4 days later, he found Henderson's feed in chaos. Somebody's team had spooked and run a wagon through the front window. Glass everywhere, merchandise scattered, Mary trying to manage the mess while her kids ran around screaming, and her husband, apparently sober for once, attempted to board up the hole. Clara was in the middle of it all, calmly directing traffic like a general managing a battlefield. "You," she said, pointing at Ethan, "can you help get that wagon moved before the whole wall comes down?" No greeting, no surprise at seeing him, just immediate deployment into the crisis. Ethan found himself grinning as he dismounted. "Yes, ma'am." They worked through the afternoon, and Ethan got to see a different side of Clara. She was efficient, organized, completely unflappable. When Mary's youngest started crying about the broken window, Clara knelt down and turned it into a game. Who could find the biggest piece of glass without getting cut? When Henderson himself showed up drunk and belligerent about the damage, she faced him down with calm facts about insurance and liability until he shuffled away muttering. By evening, the window was boarded, the merchandise sorted, and some semblance of order restored. Mary collapsed into a chair looking like she'd aged 10 years. "I don't know what I would have done without you," she said to Clara. "Both of you," she added, nodding at Ethan. "You would have figured it out," Clara said. "You always do." After they left Henderson's, Ethan and Clara walked toward the cafe without discussing it, like it was already understood where they'd end up. "You're good in a crisis," Ethan observed. "Had practice. When everything's always falling apart, you learn to stay calm while you're picking up pieces." "That's a hard way to live." "It's the only way I know." They found their usual booth, and Beth brought coffee without being asked. The cafe was busy, full of people gossiping about the wagon crash and speculating about whether Henderson would finally fix that window properly or just leave it boarded until spring. "Town's talking about us," Clara said, watching the room. "More than usual." "Let them talk." "Doesn't bother you?" "Not really. You?" She considered the question. "I used to care what people thought. Spent years trying to maintain respectability, fit into proper society, be the kind of woman my husband could be proud of. Look where that got me. Sitting in a cafe with a mountain hermit in a frontier town nobody's heard of? Exactly. Which is somehow better than everything I was trying so hard to achieve." Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he'd touched her deliberately, not counting the collar straightening or the blanket wrapping. Her fingers were cool, calloused from work, and they tightened around his immediately. "I'm glad you ended up here," he said. "Me too. Most days." "What about the other days?" "The other days I remember I'm 45 and broke, and living in a boarding house, and I wonder what the hell I'm doing. But then I see you ride into town on that patient horse of yours, and it doesn't seem quite so bad." They sat like that for a while, hands linked across the table, ignoring the stares and whispers. Ethan thought about all the years he'd spent avoiding exactly this: connection, vulnerability, the risk of caring about someone who could leave or die or disappoint him. It had kept him safe, but safe wasn't the same as alive. "Clara," he said, because he'd been thinking about this for days, and if he didn't say it now he might lose his nerve, "would you come up to the ridge sometime? See where I live?" She looked surprised. "You want me to see your cabin?" "Want you to see all of it. The ridge, the view, why I stay up there. Feels wrong that you know me, but you've never seen the place that made me who I am." "That's a long ride." "I know, but spring's coming. Trail will be better soon. We could make it in a day if we left early." Clara studied their joined hands, and Ethan could see her thinking it through, weighing the implications. Going up to his cabin meant something different than coffee in town. It meant entering his world, seeing his isolation firsthand, maybe understanding things about him that were easier to hide in public. "All right," she said finally. "When the weather clears, I'll come up." "Yeah?" "Yeah. But I'm warning you now, if it's as messy as most bachelor cabins I've seen, I'm going to judge you." Ethan laughed. "It's not messy, sparse, maybe. Empty, but not messy. We'll see." They finished their coffee and walked out into a night that smelled like coming spring, mud and melting snow and something green trying to push through frozen ground. The wind had shifted, coming from the south instead of the north, carrying warmth instead of ice. At the boarding house, they stood in the hallway again, and this time Clara leaned up and kissed his cheek, quick and light. "See you in a few days," she said, then disappeared into her room before he could respond. Ethan stood in the empty hallway, hand touching the place she'd kissed, feeling like 15 years of winter might finally be ending. Spring came late to the high country that year, arriving in fits and starts like it couldn't quite commit to the idea. One day would be warm enough to shed your coat, the next you'd wake to frost coating everything white. But by mid-April, the trail to Thompson Ridge had cleared enough that Ethan felt comfortable bringing Clara up. He rode down to Red Hollow on a Saturday morning, the kind of bright, clear day that made you believe winter was finally done lying to you. Clara was waiting outside Henderson's, dressed in practical clothes she must have borrowed or bought. Heavy skirt, wool coat, boots that looked like they'd actually survive a mountain trail. "Mary let me raid her closet," Claire explained, seeing his look. "Said if I was going to ride up there with you, I needed proper gear. Also gave me a lecture about propriety that would have made my mother proud." "What'd she say?" "That you're a good man who's been alone too long, and I better not break your heart. Then she threatened to tell the whole town if I came back looking compromised." Jesus, small towns. I told her we were just going for a ride, nothing untoward. She didn't believe me. Clara paused. Should she have? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them had quite addressed yet. Ethan helped her mount the mare he'd borrowed from the livery. Tucker wasn't built for two riders, and the trail was too long to walk. "I'm bringing you to see my home," he said carefully. "Where I sleep, how I live. What happens after that, I guess we'll figure out when we get there." Clara settled into the saddle with the awkward grace of someone who hadn't ridden much. "Fair enough. Though I should warn you, I'm a terrible rider. If this horse decides to throw me, I'm definitely landing on my face. Rosie's steady, treat her decent, and she'll take care of you." They left town with half of Main Street watching, which Ethan had expected. By noon tomorrow, everyone would know Clara Voss had gone up to Ethan Crowley's cabin and exactly what time she came back down. He tried to care and found he couldn't quite manage it. The ride took most of the day. Clara did fine at first, but as the trail got steeper and the switchbacks tighter, he could see her getting tired. They stopped twice to rest the horses and stretch legs that weren't used to this kind of riding. During the second stop, sitting on a fallen log while the horses grazed, Clara looked out at the valley spreading below them and went quiet. "What?" Ethan asked. "Just thinking about perspective. Down there, Red Hollow seems like the whole world. Up here, it's just a cluster of buildings that could disappear and the mountains wouldn't even notice. That bother you?" "No, it's actually kind of comforting. Makes my problems seem smaller, too." She rubbed her thighs, wincing. "Though right now my biggest problem is that I can't feel my legs." "Oh, we're almost there. Another hour, maybe less." "Do you make this ride every time you come to town?" "Every time. That's a lot of hours alone with your thoughts." "I like it that way. Or I did, anyway." Ethan handed her his water flask. "Now I spend most of the ride thinking about what we're going to talk about when I get there. Kind of ruins the solitude." Clara smiled, drinking. "Sorry for ruining your solitude." "I'm not." They made the final climb as the sun started its descent toward the western peaks. When they crested the last rise and the cabin came into view, Ethan watched Clara's face carefully, trying to see it through her eyes. It wasn't much. Single room, stone chimney, small lean-to for Tucker, a woodpile that needed restocking. But it sat in a clearing that caught the light just right, and behind it the ridge rose up into pine forest, and beyond that you could see 3 valleys and a dozen peaks marching toward the horizon. Clara dismounted slowly, holding the saddle for support, until her legs remembered how to work. Then she walked toward the edge of the clearing, looking out at the view. "Oh," she said quietly. Ethan came to stand beside her. "Yeah. You see this every day? Every day the weather's clear enough. I think I understand now why you stay up here." She turned to look at the cabin. "Can I see inside?" He felt suddenly nervous, like she was about to see something more intimate than just his living space, but he led her to the door and pushed it open. Clara stepped inside, and Ethan tried not to hold his breath while she looked around. It really was sparse. Bed in one corner, table, and 2 chairs he'd made himself, shelves with supplies organized by type. The fireplace, a few cooking implements. Nothing decorative, nothing personal except a photograph face down on the shelf. She walked the perimeter slowly, running her hand along the table, checking the tightness of his joinery, examining how he'd chinked the logs. Then she picked up the photograph, turned it over. "Your wife," she said. It wasn't a question. Sarah. Yeah. Clara studied the image for a long moment. She was beautiful. She was. How old was she here? 24, I think, year after we married. You loved her a lot. I did. Ethan took the photograph, looked at Sarah's young face. But she's been gone a long time. Took me most of those years to figure out that surviving isn't the same as living. Clara touched his arm, brief and gentle. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. All right. Are you looking at me and seeing her? Some kind of replacement or second chance at what you lost? Ethan set the photograph back on the shelf, this time face up. No, you're nothing like Sarah. She was young, optimistic, believed the world was basically good. You're cool, older, cynical, and know exactly how bad the world can be. I was going to say realistic and strong and built to last. But yeah, that too. He turned to face her fully. I'm not trying to recreate what I had. I'm trying to figure out what I might have if I'm brave enough to reach for it. Clara's eyes were bright, but she didn't look away. I'm scared, Ethan. I've failed at this before. Marriage, trust, believing in someone. What if I fail again? Then we fail together. That's still better than succeeding at being alone. She laughed, shaky but real. You have a way of making terrible odds sound romantic. It's a gift. They stood in the middle of his small cabin, close enough to touch but not touching, the afternoon light slanting through the window. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat, could see the pulse in Clara's throat, could feel 15 years of carefully constructed walls threatening to come down completely. I should start a fire, he said, because if he didn't move soon, he was going to kiss her, and he wanted to be sure that's what she wanted too. It's cold up here once the sun goes down. I can help. They worked together, falling into an easy rhythm, Ethan building the fire while Clara explored his supplies, finding coffee and the makings of a simple meal. She moved around his space like she belonged there, and something about that made Ethan's chest feel tight. You keep a neat house, she observed, slicing bread he'd baked 3 days ago. I was expecting typical bachelor chaos. Hard to lose things when you don't have much to lose. Still, this is organized, intentional. She paused, knife in hand. It's also incredibly lonely. You've built a perfect space for one person who doesn't want to need anything or anyone. Yeah, well, seemed like a good idea at the time. And now? Now it feels like a cage I built myself. The fire caught and spread, filling the cabin with warmth and light. They ate simple food, bread, cheese, some dried meat, and drank coffee while the sun set over the mountains, turning the sky every color fire could make. Clara walked to the window, watching the light show. Do you ever get lonely up here? Used to think I did. But it was more like an ache I'd gotten so used to, I forgot it wasn't supposed to be there. And now? Now I know the difference. Real loneliness is when someone you care about is down in the valley and you're up here missing them. She turned, and in the fading light, her face looked younger somehow, more open. Is that what you feel when you're up here between trips to town? Every single day. Clara crossed the room and sat on the edge of his bed, the only real furniture besides the chairs. Come here. Ethan sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. Clara took his hand, studying it like it might contain answers to questions she hadn't asked yet. I need to tell you something, she said. The whole truth, not just the parts I thought you could handle. All right. When I left Denver after the jail incident, I was done. Not just with that city or that job, but with everything. I had a bottle of laudanum I'd been carrying for weeks, telling myself it was for emergencies. Her voice was steady, clinical. I got as far as some nameless town in the middle of nowhere, rented a room, and sat there trying to decide if I had the courage to take it. Ethan's hand tightened on hers, but he didn't interrupt. What stopped me wasn't hope or faith or some sudden revelation. It was anger. I was so furious that men like my husband and my boss got to live comfortable lives while I was the one broken by their choices. So I flushed the laudanum, spent my last money on a train ticket west, and decided if I was going to be miserable, I might as well do it somewhere with better scenery. That's when you came to Red Hollow? Eventually. Worked my way through a dozen towns first, always looking for the place where I could finally stop running. She looked at him then, and her eyes were fierce. I'm telling you this because you need to know what you're getting into. I'm not some tragic heroine waiting to be saved. I'm a woman who seriously considered ending her own life less than a year ago. That's not romantic, it's just true. I know, Ethan said quietly. Do you? Because it's easy to imagine you can handle someone else's darkness until you're actually living with it. Clara, I spent 15 years alone on this mountain because I couldn't face the world that took my wife. I know about darkness. I know about waking up and wondering why you bothered. I know about building walls so high you forget what it's like to feel anything except safe and numb. Then why are you trying to tear them down now? Because safe and numb isn't living, and I'm tired of just surviving. Clara pulled her hand away, stood up, walked to the fireplace. What if I can't do this? What if I'm too broken? What if you're not? That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. Ethan stood too, but kept his distance. Look, I'm not going to lie and say this is easy or that I know what I'm doing. I don't. But I know that for the first time in 15 years, I want something more than just making it through another winter. That's got to count for something. Want isn't enough. I wanted my marriage to work. I wanted my life in Boston. I wanted to believe people were basically decent. Wanting things doesn't make them real. No, but it's a start. And starts are better than endings. Clara turned, and there were tears on her face now, though her voice stayed level. I'm so tired, Ethan. I'm tired of fighting and losing and picking myself back up. What if I let myself want this and it destroys me? What if it doesn't? She laughed, wiping her eyes. You're relentless. Sarah used to say that, usually when I was being stubborn about something stupid. Was she right? Always. They stood on opposite sides of the cabin, the fire crackling between them, and Ethan could feel the moment balanced on something fragile. Clara could shut down, rebuild her walls, ride back to town in the morning, and keep their relationship at the safe distance of coffee and conversation. Or she could step forward. She stepped forward. I'm going to try, she said, and her voice shook but her eyes were clear. I can't promise I won't run if things get hard. I can't promise I know how to do this right, but I'm going to try. Ethan closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, pressing her face against his chest, and he could feel her shaking with the effort of letting someone in. He held her carefully, like she was something precious and breakable, even though he knew she was stronger than she looked. We'll figure it out, he said into her hair. Both of us, together. We'll make mistakes and mess things up and probably hurt each other because that's what people do. But we'll figure it out. Clara pulled back enough to look at his face. I haven't been held like this in years. How's it feel? Terrifying and good. Mostly terrifying. Ethan brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb catching on her cheek. I want to kiss you, but I need you to tell me that's what you want too. Yes, she said, and there was no hesitation in it. Yes, that's what I want. He kissed her carefully, giving her time to change her mind, to pull away. But Clara leaned into it, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like promise and possibility and relief all mixed together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara laughed shakily. Well, that was... yeah. What do we do now? Ethan looked around his cabin at the single bed and the late hour and the fact that riding back to town in the dark would be suicide. I sleep on the floor, you take the bed. We make breakfast in the morning and ride down together before the town decides we've eloped. That's very proper of you. I'm trying to be a gentleman. I appreciate that. But Ethan? She kissed him again, quick and sure. I'm 45 years old. I don't need protecting from my own decisions. Noted. But we've got time, Clara. No need to rush anything. She smiled, and it was that real smile he'd fallen for the first day. Look at you, being patient and reasonable. Don't get used to it. I'm mostly improvising. They settled into an awkward but comfortable evening, Ethan making up a bed on the floor with extra blankets while Clara changed into a shirt of his for sleeping. They talked quietly in the firelight about small things, safe things, the kind of conversation that let them both calm down from the intensity of what had just happened. Eventually, Clara climbed into his bed, and Ethan stretched out on the floor, and they lay there in the dark listening to the wind in the pines. Ethan? Claire's voice came soft from above. Yeah? Thank you for bringing me up here, for letting me see this part of you. Thanks for coming, for trusting me enough to make the ride. I'm still scared. Me too. Good. At least we're scared together. Ethan smiled into the darkness. Get some sleep. Morning comes early up here. He listened to her breathing slow and deepen, heard the exact moment she fell asleep. Then he lay awake longer than he should have, thinking about how his cabin felt different with another person in it. Not crowded, just less empty, like a space that had been waiting for someone to fill it. The wind picked up around midnight, and Ethan woke to the sound of something hitting the roof. Then again, harder. He sat up, listening. Snow. He went to the window, looked out at heavy flakes already starting to accumulate. Behind him, Clara stirred. What's wrong? Storm came in. Wasn't supposed to until next week. Clara joined him at the window, wrapped in his blanket. They watched the snow fall in the moonlight, already coating the ground white. How bad? She asked. Bad enough? We're not riding down in this. How long? Could be a day, could be 3. Depends on how hard it comes down and whether the wind piles it into drifts. He felt Clara tense beside him. Mary will worry. The whole town will. I know. Can't be helped. We go down that trail in a blizzard, and we'll both end up dead. Better to be the subject of gossip than frozen corpses. This is going to destroy my reputation. You have a reputation? She laughed despite herself. Fair point, but still. Trapped in a cabin with Red Hollow's hermit during a snowstorm? That's the kind of story people tell for years. Let them tell it. We'll know the truth. They stood at the window together, watching winter make one last stand against spring. Ethan could feel Clara's warmth through the blanket, could smell coffee in her hair from earlier, could sense her working through the implications of being stranded. Well, she said finally, at least I'll get to see if you're as good at cabin life as you claim. I'll try not to disappoint. Do you have enough supplies? Enough for 2 people for a week, easy. Won't be fancy, but we won't starve. Clara turned away from the window, and in the dim light, he could see her face was composed, accepting. Then I guess we make the best of it. They went back to their separate sleeping arrangements, but Ethan could tell neither of them was sleeping much. The storm hammered at the cabin, wind screaming through the pines, and snow piled up against the walls faster than he liked. Around 3 in the morning, Clara spoke into the darkness. Tell me about Sarah. The real story, not just the tragic parts. Ethan considered pretending to be asleep, but Clara deserved better than that. What do you want to know? What made you love her? He thought about it, really thought. She laughed at everything, not in a shallow way, but like she genuinely found joy in small things. A good sunset, fresh bread, the way Tucker would lean into her when she brushed him. She made ordinary things feel special. How did you meet? Church social? Her family had just moved to Red Hollow, and she looked terrified. I asked her to dance because I felt sorry for her. Very romantic. Hey, it worked. She said yes, stepped on my feet through 3 songs, then asked if I wanted to get some air. We talked for 2 hours while everyone else danced. What did you talk about? Everything, nothing. She wanted to know about the mountains, about living in a place so remote. I wanted to know about Denver, about life in a city. We were opposites in a lot of ways. Clara was quiet for a moment. Do you think that's why it worked? The difference? Maybe. Or maybe we were just young enough to believe love was enough to bridge any gap. Ethan rolled onto his side, though he couldn't see Clara in the dark. What about you? What made you marry your husband? Security, or the illusion of it. Her voice was flat, honest. He was established, wealthy, everything my parents wanted for me, and I was tired of being a burden on my family, tired of waiting for my life to start. He seemed like a solution. That's not love. No, it wasn't. I convinced myself it was, or that it would become love eventually. But looking back, I think I was just scared of ending up alone. She laughed, bitter. Joke's on me, I guess. Ended up alone anyway. You're not alone now. For a few days, trapped in a blizzard. That's temporary. Doesn't have to be. The words hung in the dark cabin, heavy with implication. Ethan heard Clara shift, heard the bed creak as she sat up. "What are you saying, Ethan?" He sat up too, fumbling for the lamp. When light filled the cabin, he could see Clara wrapped in blankets, hair loose around her shoulders, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I'm saying I don't want temporary. I want you to stay. Not just until the storm passes or until you get bored of Red Hollow. I want you to stay with me. Here on this mountain, here, town, wherever. I don't care about the location. I care about not being alone anymore, about waking up and knowing you're still there." Clara pulled the blanket tighter. "That's a big thing to say to someone you've known for 6 weeks. I know, but I also know that I'm 42 years old and I've wasted 15 years being half alive. I don't want to waste any more time being careful and reasonable and protecting myself from getting hurt. What if I hurt you anyway? Then I'll survive it, and at least I'll know I tried." She climbed out of bed, came to sit beside him on the floor. In the lamplight, her face showed every year she'd lived, every hardship she'd survived, and Ethan thought she'd never looked more beautiful. "I don't know how to do this," she said quietly. "How to be what someone needs." "Neither do I. We'll figure it out as we go. What if I wake up one day and decide I can't do it? What if I run? Then I'll let you go, but I hope you won't." Clara touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines time and weather had carved there. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the most foolish." "Probably both." She kissed him then, and it was different from earlier, slower, deeper, less about testing waters and more about diving in. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "I'm staying," Clara said. "For now, for as long as I can make it work, I'm staying. But Ethan, I need you to know that I'm going to mess this up sometimes. I'm going to push you away when I get scared and say things I don't mean and probably run at least once before I convince myself to come back." "I know." "And you're okay with that?" "Clara, I lived alone on a mountain for 15 years because I was too scared to try again. I'm in no position to judge anyone else's fear." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that while the storm raged outside and the fire burned down to embers. Eventually, they both dozed off, tangled together on the floor, neither willing to let go long enough to move to proper sleeping arrangements. Ethan woke at dawn to find Clara still pressed against him, her face peaceful in sleep. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh snow that glittered in the early light. They were trapped for certain now, no way to make the trail down until the snow settled and he could dig out a path. It would take days, maybe a week. Clara stirred, opened her eyes, and smiled sleepily at him. "Morning." "Morning. Still snowing. How bad?" "Bad enough that Mary's going to have a lot to say when we finally get back." Clara laughed, stretching. "Let her talk. I'm where I want to be." Those simple words, spoken without drama or grand gesture, settled into Ethan's chest like something warm and permanent. He kissed her forehead, then stood and started rebuilding the fire. "What do we do while we wait out the snow?" Clara asked, wrapping herself in blankets. "Talk, eat, try not to drive each other crazy in close quarters." Sounds perfect. And somehow, impossibly, it was. They spent 3 days trapped in that small cabin while winter made one final push against spring, and instead of feeling crowded or awkward, they fell into an easy rhythm. Clara proved surprisingly capable with cooking and cabin work, while Ethan taught her about reading weather and managing resources. They talked about everything and nothing, her life in Boston, his years trapping, books they'd read, places they'd never been. On the second night, as they sat by the fire, Clara said, "I lied to you about why I laughed that first day." "Oh?" "You asked me about it, and I made it sound spontaneous. But the truth is I laughed because I'd been sitting on those steps for hours, completely out of options, wondering if I should just start walking into the wilderness and see how far I got before the cold took me. Then you offered to buy me something, and it was so absurd, this rough mountain man offering charity to a woman he didn't know, that I couldn't help but laugh. That's darker than I thought." "I know, but it's also true. You saved my life that day, Ethan, not because you fed me or found me work, but because you reminded me that kindness still existed, that maybe the world wasn't completely broken." Ethan took her hand. "You saved mine too. Just took me longer to realize it." On the morning of the 4th day, The sun finally broke through, and Ethan started the hard work of clearing a path down the mountain. Clara helped where she could, and together they managed to make the trail passable by afternoon. They rode down together as the sun started its descent, Clara more comfortable in the saddle now, both of them knowing what they'd be riding into. Red Hollow appeared below them like judgment waiting to be passed. "Ready for this?" Ethan asked. "Not even a little bit, but let's go anyway." They entered town just before dark, and sure enough, half of Main Street seemed to be waiting. Mary came running out of Henderson's, relief and scandal fighting for control of her face. 4 days, she said, looking between them. "You were gone for 4 days." "Storm," Ethan said simply. "I can see that. Whole town's been worried sick." "Well, worried and gossiping. Mostly gossiping." Clara dismounted carefully, handed Rosie's reins to the stable boy who'd appeared. "I'm sorry we worried you, but we're fine. Nothing happened that shouldn't have, and I'd appreciate it if people could mind their own business." Mary's eyebrows rose. "This is Red Hollow. Nobody minds their own business. Then I guess they'll have plenty to talk about." Clara turned to Ethan, and in front of half the town, she reached up and kissed him goodbye. Not a dramatic kiss, just a simple press of lips that said she wasn't ashamed or apologetic. "See you tomorrow?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Ethan confirmed. He watched her walk toward the boarding house, back straight despite exhaustion, refusing to act like someone who'd done anything wrong. Then he turned to find Mary grinning at him. "What?" he asked. "Nothing. Just glad to see you finally living again." Ethan collected his supplies and started the ride back up, even though it was nearly dark and probably foolish. But he needed to get back to his cabin, needed to sit with everything that had happened over the past 4 days. When he finally reached home, the cabin felt different. Not just empty, but incomplete. Like Clara had become part of it in those few days, and her absence left holes he could see clearly now. He built up the fire and made coffee and sat at his table, thinking about a woman in a boarding house down in the valley who'd agreed to try, who'd let him in despite every reason not to, who'd kissed him in front of the whole town like she meant it. Spring had finally arrived, bringing with it the kind of changes Ethan had thought himself too old and too damaged to experience. But maybe that was the thing about spring. It didn't care if you were ready. It came anyway, breaking through frozen ground, insisting on growth whether you'd prepared for it or not. Outside, the last of the snow dripped from the roof, and somewhere down in Red Hollow, Clara was probably fielding questions from Mrs. Fletcher about propriety and reputation. Let them talk, Ethan thought. Let them whisper and speculate and make up whatever stories they wanted. He knew the truth, and so did Clara. They'd found each other at the end of their respective roads, both of them broken and wary and convinced they were done taking chances. And then they'd taken one anyway. The gossip lasted exactly as long as Ethan expected, which was to say it never really stopped, just became part of the town's ongoing narrative. Within a week, people had moved from shock to speculation to a kind of grudging acceptance that Ethan Crowley and Clara Voss were together, whatever that meant. What it meant, in practical terms, was that Ethan started coming down from the ridge every other day instead of once a week. He'd find reasons, checking on Tucker's shoes again, picking up mail that never came, restocking supplies he didn't actually need. Nobody was fooled, least of all Clara. "You know people can tell you're just making excuses to see me," she said one afternoon, not looking up from a ledger she was balancing. "Don't care." "You should. They're starting to wonder when you're going to make an honest woman of me." She glanced up then, and there was something in her eyes that wasn't quite teasing. "Mrs. Fletcher asked me yesterday if I was expecting a proposal soon. What'd you tell her?" "That my personal life was none of her business. Then she reminded me I'm living in her boarding house and she has a right to know if her tenants are engaged in moral corruption." Clara set down her pencil. "I'm paraphrasing, but that was the gist." Ethan pulled up a chair, sitting backwards on it, with his arms folded over the back. "You want me to talk to her?" "No, I want you to tell me what we're doing, because right now we're in this strange middle ground where we're clearly together, but not actually together. And it's making people uncomfortable." "Does it make you uncomfortable?" "Sometimes. I don't like not knowing where I stand." It was early May, and through Henderson's window Ethan could see the town coming back to life after the long winter. Gardens being planted, buildings getting repaired, Children running through the streets without coats for the first time in months. Everything was moving forward except the two of them, stuck in this holding pattern neither quite knew how to break. "Come up to the ridge," Ethan said. "Not for a visit this time. Come stay. See if you can stand living with me before we make any big decisions." Clara's hands went still on the ledger. "For how long?" "A week, 2 weeks. However long it takes to figure out if this is something we can actually do or if we're just fooling ourselves. Mary needs me here. The books are still a mess, and Mary's been managing without you for years. She can handle a couple weeks. That's not fair. She hired me. She depends on me. And you're using her dependence as an excuse not to take a risk." Ethan kept his voice gentle, but he wasn't backing down. "Look, I know you're scared. I am too. But we can't keep doing this halfway thing forever. At some point, we have to figure out what we actually want." Clara stood up, walked to the window, crossed her arms. "What if I come up there and realize I can't do it, that I'm not cut out for that kind of isolation? Then you come back down and we figure out something else." "What else is there? You won't leave your mountain, and I can't live up there permanently. The math doesn't work." "Maybe I would leave the mountain, for the right reason." She turned, surprise clear on her face. "You do that?" "I don't know, maybe. That's what we need to figure out." Ethan stood, crossed to where she was standing. 15 years ago, I ran up there to hide from the world. But I'm not hiding anymore, Clara. I'm trying to build something, and I can't do that if you're down here and I'm up there. People will really talk if I move up to your cabin." "Let them talk. They're already talking." Clara looked at him for a long moment, and Ethan could see her working through calculations, weighing risks against rewards, trying to protect herself from one more disappointment. Then something in her face shifted, the same way it had in the cabin during the storm. 2 weeks, she said. "I'll tell Mary I need 2 weeks to deal with personal business. But Ethan, if this doesn't work, then we'll know. And knowing is better than wondering." She kissed him then, quick and fierce, and Ethan tasted fear and hope in equal measure. When she pulled back, her hands were shaking slightly. "I need a few days to arrange things. Make sure Mary can manage without me. Pack what I'll need." "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." 3 days later, Ethan rode down to find Clara waiting outside Henderson's with a canvas bag and a bedroll. She'd borrowed more practical clothes from Mary. Trousers, a heavy shirt, boots that looked like they'd survived mountain living. Her hair was braided tight, and her face was set in that expression Ethan had learned meant she was terrified but doing it anyway. Mary came out to see them off, pulling Clara into a hard hug. "You come back if you need to, no questions asked." "I will. And Mary, thank you. For everything. Just don't let him turn you into a complete hermit. We need you back eventually." The write-up was different this time. Clara was quieter, more nervous, checking her bags compulsively like she might have forgotten something crucial. Ethan let her be, understanding that she needed the silence to prepare herself. About halfway up, they stopped to rest the horses. Clara stood at the edge of the trail, looking down at Red Hollow, already small below them. "Last time I came up here, it was temporary," she said. "This feels different." "It is different. What if I hate it? What if 2 days in I'm climbing the walls? Then we'll deal with it. But Clara, you need to actually try, not just go through the motions waiting to fail." She turned to look at him. "Is that what you think I do?" "I think you've been failed by enough people that you've learned to fail yourself first. Saves time and disappointment." "That's harsh." "It's also true." Clara's jaw tightened, and for a second Ethan thought she might turn around and ride back down. Then she mounted Rosie and started up the trail without another word. They reached the cabin as the sun started its descent, painting everything gold and orange. Ethan helped Clara down, showed her where to put her things, tried not to hover while she looked around his space with new eyes, not as a visitor this time, but as someone who might actually live there. "It's smaller than I remembered," she said finally. "Yeah. There's no separate bedroom." "No. The stove's going to be a problem. I'm not used to cooking on something that temperamental." "I'll teach you." Clara set her bag down, walked the perimeter again like she was measuring something. "Where would my things go? All my clothes, my books if I had any, just my stuff?" Ethan looked around the cabin, seeing it fresh through her perspective. She was right. It was built for one person who didn't have much. There wasn't room for a second life, not without changes. We'd make room, he said. Build some shelves, maybe add a trunk, figure it out as we go. You're being very accommodating. I want this to work. Why? The question came out sharp, frustrated. Why me? You could find someone younger, less complicated. Someone who'd fit into your life without requiring everything to change. Because I don't want someone who fits easily. I want someone who makes me question things, who pushes back, who's got her own ideas about how life should be lived. Ethan crossed to where she stood. I want you, Clara, with all your complications and damage and sharp edges, not despite those things, because of them. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. I'm going to disappoint you. Probably. I'll disappoint you too. That's how people are. Such a romantic. Never claimed to be romantic, just honest. Clara laughed, shaky but real, and some of the tension bled out of the room. Okay, 2 weeks. Let's see what happens. What happened over the next 2 weeks was both easier and harder than either of them expected. The easy parts were practical. Clara learned to manage the wood stove, to read weather in the wind, to tell the difference between animal sounds that meant danger and ones that were just the mountain doing its thing. She took to the rhythm of cabin life quicker than Ethan anticipated, finding ways to make the space more functional without changing its essential character. The hard parts were emotional. They fought, small arguments that flared up over nothing and everything. Clara got frustrated with the isolation, missed having other people around, felt trapped by weather that kept them inside for days. Ethan struggled with having his space invaded, his routines disrupted, another person's moods and needs constantly demanding attention. On day 5, Clara threw a plate at the wall. It didn't break. Ethan's plates were tin, but it made a hell of a noise and left a dent in the log wall. They both stared at it for a second, shocked. I'm sorry, Clara said immediately. I shouldn't have. Why'd you do it? Because you were being impossible. I was trying to reorganize the supplies, and you kept telling me I was doing it wrong, and I just... She stopped, pressed her hands to her face. I can't do this. I can't live somewhere where everything has to be exactly one way, and I'm always the one doing it wrong. I wasn't saying you were wrong. I was trying to explain the system. There is no system, Ethan. You just put things where you put them, and now you're attached to it because it's how you've done it for 15 years. It works. For you. But I'm here now, and I need things to work for me, too. They stood on opposite sides of the cabin, breathing hard, and Ethan felt the whole experiment threatening to collapse. This was it, the moment where Clara would say it wasn't working, pack her things, ride back down to a life that made sense. Instead, she started laughing. What? Ethan asked, defensive. I threw a plate at your wall. Over shelf organization. We're insane. Little bit. This is never going to work if we can't even agree on where to put the flour. So what do we do? Clara picked up the dented plate, examined it. We compromise. You show me why you put things where you do, and I show you where I'd put them. We find something that works for both of us. That simple? Probably not, but it's a start. They spent the next hour reorganizing supplies, negotiating each decision like diplomats working out a treaty. It was exhausting and occasionally frustrating, but it also felt important, like they were learning how to build something together instead of just accommodating each other's already built lives. That night, lying in bed together, because after a week of Ethan sleeping on the floor, they'd both agreed it was ridiculous, Clara said, I think I'm starting to understand why you stayed up here. Yeah? It's quiet in a way that lets you hear yourself think. Down in town, there's always noise, always people wanting something. Up here, it's just us and the mountain. Gets lonely, though. Not with 2 people. She rolled over to face him in the dark. I'm still scared this won't work. Me too. But I'm starting to believe it might. Ethan pulled her closer, feeling her settle against his chest. That's progress. The second week was better. They found their rhythm, learned each other's patterns. Clara discovered she liked the physical work of mountain living, chopping wood, hauling water, maintaining the cabin. Ethan discovered he liked having someone to talk to who pushed back, questioned his assumptions, made him defend choices he'd never examined. On day 12, they were working on expanding the cabin's storage when Clara stopped mid-hammer swing. I don't want to go back, she said. Ethan looked up from the board he was measuring. To town? To my old life, the boarding house, keeping books for other people, pretending I'm fine on my own. I don't want that anymore. What do you want? She set down the hammer, came to sit beside him. This, you. A life where I'm building something instead of just surviving. But Ethan, I can't just quit Henderson's. Mary depends on that income, and I gave my word. So we figure it out. Maybe you go down a few days a week, work part-time. Or maybe we find someone else who can take over the bookkeeping. There are options. You'd be okay with me going down to town regularly? Rather have you here most of the time than down there all the time. Clara kissed him, slow and thorough, and when she pulled back, her eyes were bright. Ask me. Ask you what? You know what. Stop being dense. Ethan's heart started hammering because he did know. He'd known since that first storm, maybe since that first laugh. He'd just been waiting for the right moment, and Clara was telling him the moment was now. He took her hands. Clara Voss, will you marry me? Will you stay up on this ridiculous mountain with a stubborn hermit who's going to drive you crazy half the time? Will you let me try to make you happy, even though I'm terrible at it and will mess up constantly? That's the worst proposal I've ever heard. It's honest. I know. That's why I'm saying yes. They sat there in the half-built storage edition, covered in sawdust, and Ethan felt something unlock in his chest that had been closed for 15 years. Clara was crying, which made him start to tear up too, and they held each other like they were the only solid things in a shifting world. I don't have a ring, Ethan said finally. Don't need one. Not yet, anyway. We should probably tell people, make it official. Eventually, but can we just have this for a few days? Just us, before the town gets involved? Yeah, we can do that. They finished the storage edition working in comfortable silence, both of them adjusting to this new reality they'd committed to. When the sun set, they sat on the cabin steps and watched the valley darken below, Red Hollow's lights winking on one by one. My mother would have hated this, Clara said. You, me, this whole situation. She spent her whole life trying to marry me off to someone respectable and wealthy, and here I am engaged to a mountain man in the middle of nowhere. Sorry to disappoint her. Don't be. She was wrong about almost everything. Clara leaned against his shoulder. She thought security came from money and status. Took me 45 years to figure out it comes from knowing someone will catch you when you fall. I'll catch you. I know. That's why I said yes. They went back down to town 3 days later, and the news spread like wildfire. Mary screamed and hugged Clara so hard she nearly cracked a rib. Mrs. Fletcher announced she'd known all along and that she'd be happy to host the wedding at the boarding house. Harmon offered Ethan a cigar and said he'd never thought he'd see the day. The only person who had reservations was Henderson himself, who cornered Ethan outside the feed store with a look that meant business. You planning to take her back up that mountain permanently? He asked. That's the idea. Mary says Clara's the best bookkeeper she's ever had. Says the business would fall apart without her. Clara's going to keep working a few days a week. We talked about it. Henderson squinted at him. You sure about this? She's a town woman, used to people and conversation. Mountain living's hard, especially for someone who didn't grow up to it. I know. We'll figure it out. And if you can't? Then we'll figure that out too. Ethan met the old man's eyes. Look, I appreciate the concern, but Clara's not some fragile thing that needs protecting. She's survived worse than living on a mountain with me. Henderson considered this, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. Just don't make her regret saying yes. Doing my best not to. They decided on a simple wedding, no big ceremony or fuss. Clara wore a dress Mary helped her make, nothing fancy but clean and new. Ethan wore his best shirt and actually trimmed his beard for the occasion. They stood in front of the circuit preacher who came through town once a month, with Mary and her family as witnesses, and promised to love each other through whatever came next. It wasn't romantic or elaborate. The preacher rushed through the ceremony because he had 3 more weddings scheduled that day. Clara stumbled over her vows. Ethan's hands shook when he slipped the ring on her finger, a simple band he'd traded 3 months of fur trapping for. But when the preacher said they were married and Ethan kissed his wife for the first time, it felt right in a way nothing had felt in 15 years. The reception was at the cafe, Beth insisting on providing food for free because, in her words, It's about damn time Ethan Crowley rejoined the human race. People came through all afternoon to offer congratulations, most of them genuinely happy, a few clearly scandalized that a respectable widow had married the town hermit. Clara handled it all with grace, accepting well wishes and deflecting intrusive questions with the same calm competence she brought to everything. Ethan stayed close, his hand finding hers whenever the crowd got too thick or the questions too personal. Late in the afternoon, when most people had cleared out, Mary pulled Clara aside. Ethan watched them talk, saw Mary gesture emphatically, while Clara listened with that focused attention she gave to things that mattered. When Clara came back, she looked uncertain. "What'd she say?" Ethan asked. "That she's happy for us, and that she found someone to take over the bookkeeping full-time, her cousin from Denver, apparently very good with numbers." "That's good news, right?" "It is. It just means I'm really leaving. No safety net, no fallback plan. Just you and me and the mountain." Ethan took her hand. "Having second thoughts?" "About 100 of them. But I'm doing it anyway." They spent their wedding night at the boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher insisted, saying it was improper to ride up to the cabin in the dark, even if they were married now. In the morning, they packed Clara's few remaining possessions and started the familiar ride up the mountain. But this time was different. This time, Clara wasn't visiting or trying out mountain life or testing whether she could handle it. This time, she was going home. The cabin looked the same as always when they arrived, small, simple, functional. But Clara walked in like she owned it, immediately starting to rearrange things to make space for her belongings. Ethan helped, learning to compromise on shelf space and storage systems, figuring out how two people's lives could fit into a space built for one. That night, they lay in bed listening to the wind in the pines, and Clara said, "I'm terrified." "Of what?" "That I'll wake up one day and regret this. That the isolation will drive me crazy. That I'll resent you for taking me away from town." "And what if you don't?" "Then I'll have everything I never knew I wanted." Ethan kissed her temple. "Worth the risk?" "Ask me in a year." But she smiled when she said it, and her hand found his under the blankets, and they fell asleep tangled together while the mountain settled around them for the night. The first few months of marriage were an education in compromise and patience. Clara struggled with the isolation, especially during weeks when weather kept them cabin-bound. She missed casual conversation, missed having people around, missed the small pleasures of town life she'd taken for granted. Ethan struggled with sharing space, with having his routines constantly disrupted, with the emotional labor of checking in with another person instead of just doing whatever seemed right to him. They fought about small things that stood in for bigger fears. Where to put the firewood, how to organize the pantry, whether they needed a second chair. Each argument was really about whether this was sustainable, whether they'd made a terrible mistake, whether love was enough to bridge the gap between two very different lives. But they also learned when to push and when to back off, learned how to apologize, how to admit when they were wrong, how to ask for what they needed instead of expecting the other person to read minds. It wasn't smooth or easy or anything like the romance Clara had imagined as a young woman. It was better. One evening in late September, sitting on the cabin steps watching the first snow of the season dust the peaks, Clara said, "I think I'm happy." "You think?" "I've been unhappy for so long I'm not sure I recognize the feeling. But yeah, I think this is happiness." Ethan put his arm around her, pulled her close. "Good. Because I know I am." "Even though I reorganized your entire kitchen and you can't find anything anymore?" "Even though that. Even though you talk during breakfast when I'm trying to be quiet. Even though you insist on keeping that awful chair you brought up from town. It's a good chair. It's hideous and uncomfortable. But it's mine, and you love me enough to let me keep it." "Unfortunately, yes." Clara laughed, and the sound of it echoed across the clearing, clear and real and full of something that might actually be joy. Ethan thought about the woman he'd first seen sitting on store steps, tired and broke and out of options. Thought about the journey that had brought them both to this moment, all the pain and loss and wrong turns that had somehow led them to each other. "Thank you," Claire said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me that day. For offering coffee instead of pity. For being stubborn enough to keep coming back even when I tried to push you away. Thank you for laughing. For saying yes. for taking a chance on a hermit who had no business asking you to marry him. They sat there until the cold drove them inside, then built up the fire and made dinner together in their small cabin that somehow felt exactly the right size now. And when they went to bed that night, wrapped around each other against the coming winter, both of them understood that they'd found something rare and precious. Not perfection, not easy, but real, and fought for, and entirely their own. The mountain settled around them, indifferent to human drama, but providing a solid foundation nonetheless. And in that cabin on Thompson Ridge, two people who'd given up on happiness learned to build it anyway, one difficult day at a time. Winter came hard that year, settling over Thompson Ridge like it meant to stay forever. By November, snow had piled so high against the cabin walls that Ethan had to dig out the door every morning just to reach the woodpile. The trail down to Red Hollow became impassable for weeks at a time, cutting them off from the outside world more completely than Clara had experienced yet. She handled it better than Ethan expected. Some days she'd stare out the window with a look that made him nervous, like she was calculating how far she could walk before the cold took her. But other days she'd throw herself into projects, reorganizing their supplies, mending clothes, teaching herself to bake bread that didn't come out like stones. "You're restless," Ethan observed one morning in early December, watching her pace the small cabin for the third time in an hour. "I'm fine." "Clara." She stopped, turned to face him. "I'm going crazy. There, I said it. I love you. I love this life we're building, but I'm going absolutely insane being trapped in this cabin with nothing to do and no one to talk to except you." "Thanks. You know what I mean. You're used to this. I'm not. I need people, Ethan. I need conversations that aren't about firewood and whether the chimney needs cleaning. I need problems to solve that aren't which shelf the flour goes on." Ethan set down the knife he'd been sharpening. "What do you want me to do about it? I can't make the snow melt faster." "I don't know. I'm just telling you how I feel." "And I'm supposed to fix it?" "No, you're supposed to listen and not make me feel like I'm failing because I'm struggling." They stared at each other across the cabin, tension crackling between them. This was the biggest fight yet, the one Ethan had been dreading since Clara moved up. The moment where she'd realized mountain life wasn't romantic or peaceful, just hard and isolating and relentlessly the same. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "You're right. I should listen instead of getting defensive." Clara's shoulders dropped. "And I should be more patient. I knew what I was signing up for." "Did you, though?" "Knowing it in theory and living it are different things." She came to sit beside him. "I don't regret marrying you, but I'm starting to understand why you were alone up here for 15 years. It takes a specific kind of person to handle this much isolation, and I'm not sure I'm that person." "So what do we do?" "I don't know. That's what scares me." They sat in silence while the wind screamed outside and the fire crackled, both of them facing the possibility that love might not be enough to bridge the gap between who they were and what this life required. That night, Clara got sick. It started with a cough that Ethan tried to ignore, then a fever that spiked so fast it scared them both. By morning she was burning up, barely coherent, and Ethan found himself facing his worst fear, watching someone he loved suffer while being too far from help to do anything about it. He tried everything he knew: cool cloths on her forehead, willow bark tea for the fever, keeping her warm but not too warm. But Clara kept getting worse, her breathing turning shallow and labored, her skin pale except for 2 bright spots of color on her cheeks. On the second day, Ethan made a decision. The trail was impassable for horses, but he could walk it. Could make it down to Red Hollow in maybe 6 hours if he pushed hard, bring back the doctor or at least proper medicine. It was risky. If the weather turned while he was gone, Clara would be alone and helpless. But doing nothing felt riskier. He was pulling on his boots when Clara's hand caught his wrist. "Don't," she whispered, her voice raw. "Don't leave me alone. I need to get help. You'll die on that trail, and then I'll die here. At least if you stay, we're together." "Clara, please." Her eyes were glassy with fever, but clear enough to show real fear. "I've been alone too many times. If this is it, I don't want to be alone." Ethan took off his boots, climbed back into bed beside her, and held her while she shivered and burned. He'd never felt more helpless in his life. All those years of surviving on the mountain, learning to be self-sufficient, to handle whatever nature threw at him. None of it mattered when the person he loved was sick, and there was nothing he could do except wait. "I'm sorry," Clara mumbled against his chest. "Sorry for complaining about the cabin, about being bored. This is what matters, just being here. Shh, save your strength. Need to tell you something. Can wait." "No, needs to be now." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "That first day when you offered to buy me something, I wasn't just hungry, Ethan. I was done. I'd given up. I was sitting on those steps trying to decide if I had the courage to walk out into the wilderness and just keep walking until I couldn't anymore." "I know. You don't, though, because what I didn't tell you was that when you made that offer, when you looked at me like I was a person worth caring about, something broke inside me. The bad kind of break. The kind that hurts. Because I realized I was still alive enough to want kindness, still capable of feeling something other than defeat." Ethan held her tighter. "Clara, you need to rest." That's why I laughed, because it was absurd and painful and somehow exactly what I needed to hear, that I was still here, still capable of beginning again. She coughed, hard enough to shake her whole body. "If I die up here, I need you to know that these months with you have been worth everything that came before. All the pain, all the loss. It led me to you, and that makes it worth it." "You're not dying. You don't know that." "I do. Because I won't let you." "We didn't come this far to quit now." Clara smiled weakly. "Stubborn. Damn right." He stayed with her through that day and the next, barely sleeping, keeping the fire going, forcing water and medicine down her throat when she'd take it. On the third day, the fever broke. I woke up weak and wrung out, but clear-eyed and breathing normally. "You're still here," she said, like she'd expected to wake up alone. "Where else would I be?" "Getting help, being sensible instead of romantic." Turned out romance worked better. She reached for his hand, squeezed weakly. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for not dying. Would have really messed up my day." Clara laughed, which turned into coughing, but it was the good kind, the kind that meant she was getting better. Ethan helped her sit up, propped pillows behind her, brought her water and the last of their bread. "How long was I out?" she asked. 3 days. It felt longer. I had the strangest dreams. She sipped the water carefully. "I dreamed about Boston, about my old life, but in the dream, I couldn't remember why I'd wanted it so badly. It all seemed hollow, like a beautiful prison I'd been desperate to escape." "That's the fever talking." "Maybe. Or maybe it's clarity." Clara looked around the cabin, small, simple, built for survival rather than comfort. "I complained about this place, about being isolated and bored, but when I thought I might die here, all I could think about was that I was grateful. Grateful to be here with you instead of alone in some boarding house. Grateful that my last moments wouldn't be surrounded by strangers who didn't care." "You're not dying." "I know, but I could have. And it made me realize something." She met his eyes. "I don't need town or people or entertainment. I need you. Everything else is just details." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "That's the sickness talking. Once you're better, you'll remember how much you hate being trapped up here." "No, I might get restless again. I might struggle with the isolation, but I won't regret choosing this life. Choosing you." She squeezed his hand harder. "I'm where I want to be, Ethan. Finally." It took Clara 2 weeks to recover fully, and in that time something shifted between them. The illness had stripped away pretense, forced them both to face what really mattered. When Claire was finally strong enough to move around the cabin on her own, she did it with a new purposefulness, like she was seeing everything fresh. "We should expand," she said one morning, studying the cabin walls. "Expand what?" "The cabin. Add another room, maybe. Give us more space." "That's a lot of work. And expensive." "We've got time. And I've got money saved from Henderson's. Not much, but enough to buy lumber." She turned to him with that look he'd learned meant she'd already decided and was just waiting for him to catch up. "I want to build something here. Not just survive, but actually build a life. Thought you hated the isolation." "I hate being trapped. That's different from hating the place." Clara came to stand in front of him. "I was wrong before. When I said I needed people in conversation, what I actually need is purpose. something to work toward, and building a better home with you. That's purpose enough. They spent the rest of the winter planning. Clara sketched designs on the backs of old ledgers calculating space and materials. Ethan pointed out practical problems, but he found himself getting excited despite his caution. The cabin had been adequate for one person surviving, but two people actually living required something more. When spring finally broke and the trail cleared, they rode down to Red Hollow together. The town had survived the winter about as well as expected. A few buildings damaged by snow, old Henderson finally succumbing to the pneumonia that had been chasing him for years, Mary's youngest cutting his first tooth. They bought lumber, nails, tools they didn't already have. Harmon raised his eyebrows at the order but didn't comment, just helped them load everything onto a wagon they'd rented for the purpose. "Big plans up there?" he asked as they settled the bill. "Clara wants to expand the cabin," Ethan said. "Good. Place needs a woman's touch anyway. No offense, but it was pretty grim before." "None taken." Mary caught them before they left town, pulling Clara into a fierce hug. "You look good." "Happy." "I am happy. Surprisingly." "Not that surprising. Love does that." Mary glanced at Ethan, who was checking the wagon straps. "He's different too, less haunted. You're good for each other." "We fight constantly." "All couples do, but you're still here, still trying. That's what matters." They made the slow journey back up the mountain with their supplies, and over the next months they built an addition onto the cabin. It wasn't fancy, just one room attached to the original structure, with a real door and windows that actually opened. But it gave them space to breathe, room for Clara's things, a place that felt intentionally designed rather than just functional. Working together, they learned things about each other. Clara was better at measuring and planning. Ethan was stronger and more patient with physical labor. They complemented each other's weaknesses, compensated for each other's gaps in knowledge. The work was hard and occasionally frustrating, but it was also satisfying in a way Ethan hadn't experienced in years. One evening in July, sitting on the new porch they'd added, Clara said, "I need to tell you about the money." "What money?" "The money I saved from my inheritance, the part my husband didn't gamble away or use to pay debts." Ethan turned to look at her. "I thought you lost everything." "Almost everything, but I'd hidden some of my mother's jewelry, items that weren't in my husband's name. After the divorce, or whatever you call it when your husband abandons you, I sold them. Got about $300. That's a lot of money." "It is. And I've been carrying it with me, moving from town to town, too scared to spend it because it was my only safety net." Clara pulled a small pouch from her pocket, the leather worn smooth from years of handling. "I want to use it here. To finish the cabin properly, maybe buy some livestock. Build something real instead of just hoarding it against disaster." Ethan took the pouch, felt the weight of it. "You sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything. This is home now. You're home. I'm done running." They used the money wisely, bought 2 goats for milk, chickens for eggs, enough lumber to build a proper barn. The mountain property transformed from a survival camp into something that resembled a real homestead. It was still isolated, still challenging, but it felt alive in a way it never had when Ethan lived there alone. By fall, Clara had started keeping bees. By winter, she'd taught herself to preserve food well enough that they didn't have to rely solely on Ethan's hunting and trapping. The cabin filled with jars of jam and pickled vegetables, strings of dried herbs, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. "We're becoming self-sufficient," Clara observed one evening, surveying their stores. "That was always the goal." "No, your goal was survival. This is different. This is thriving." Ethan looked around the cabin, expanded, improved, filled with signs of 2 people building a life together. "Yeah, I guess it is." The second winter was easier than the first. Clara still got restless during the long months of isolation, but she'd found ways to manage it. She'd started writing, nothing she planned to publish, just observations about mountain life, stories from her past, thoughts about the future. Ethan would find her bent over paper in the lamplight, pencil moving steadily, and he'd learned not to interrupt. In February, a massive storm hit that made the previous year's weather look mild. Snow fell for 3 days straight, piling up past the windows, burying the woodpile, making the world outside disappear into white nothing. They were completely cut off, no way down, and no way anyone could reach them. "This is the test, isn't it?" Clara said on the second day. watching snow pile against the window. What test? Whether I can really handle this life. Trapped in a cabin with nothing but you and my own thoughts for company. How you doing so far? She considered. Better than I expected. I'm not climbing the walls yet. Yet? Ask me on day 5. But day 5 came and went, and Clara stayed calm. She read, she wrote, she cooked elaborate meals just to pass time. They played cards with a deck so old the faces were barely visible. They talked about everything and nothing, and when they ran out of things to say, they sat in comfortable silence. On day 7, when the storm finally passed and they dug their way out to a world transformed by snow, Clara stood in the doorway breathing deep. I made it, she said. Never doubted you would. I did. Every day of that storm I doubted, but I made it anyway. That spring, they got word that Mary was pregnant again, number 7, and struggling with the feed store. Would Clara consider coming down once a week to help with the books, just until Mary got through the difficult early months? Ethan expected Clara to jump at the chance. Instead, she thought about it for 3 days before giving her answer. I'll do it, she told Mary on their next trip down. But just 1 day a week, and only until the baby comes. This is temporary. You sure? Thought you'd want the excuse to get off that mountain more often. Clara glanced at Ethan, who was pretending not to listen while checking Tucker's saddle. The mountain's my home now. I'll help because you need it and you're my friend. But I don't need saving for my own life anymore. That summer, Ethan turned 43. Clara threw him a party, just the two of them. Dinner cooked over the fire. A cake that turned out lopsided but tasted fine. She'd somehow acquired whiskey and real coffee, luxuries they rarely indulged in. To surviving another year, Clara said, raising her cup. To more than surviving, Ethan countered. To actually living. They touched cups, drank. The whiskey burned going down, warm and solid. I need to ask you something, Clara said, suddenly serious, and I need you to answer honestly. All right? Do you miss her, Sarah? Ethan had known this question would come eventually. Sometimes, but not the way I used to. What's different? Used to miss her like she was a piece of me that got torn away, like I'd never be whole without her. Now I miss her, like you miss any good thing that's gone. Sad, but not devastating. Does it bother you that I'm nothing like her? No. If you were like her, I'd probably still be alone. I don't need a replacement, Clara. I needed someone who could meet me where I actually am, not where I was 15 years ago. Clara traced the rim of her cup. I compare you to my husband sometimes, not favorably for him, obviously, but I catch myself thinking about how different you are, how you actually see me instead of seeing what you want me to be. He was an idiot. He was human, flawed and selfish and weak, like most people. She looked up at Ethan. Like us. We're not like him. No, but we're not perfect either. We fight, we get frustrated, we hurt each other sometimes without meaning to. Yeah, but we stay. That's the difference. Clara smiled, and in the firelight she looked younger than her years. We do stay. Even when it's hard, even when we're not sure it's working, we stay and figure it out. That's marriage. Is it? Because it doesn't look like what I thought marriage was supposed to be. What did you think it was supposed to be? Easy, romantic, two people floating through life on the power of their feelings. She laughed. Turns out, it's more like two people building something together. Sometimes the construction goes well, sometimes you hit obstacles. But you keep building. I like that better anyway. So do I. They sat in front of the fire drinking whiskey and eating lopsided cake, and Ethan felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for as long as he could remember. This was it. This was the life he'd stopped believing was possible, messy and imperfect and built on compromise, but real in a way nothing else had ever been. In October, they made their monthly trip to town and found it buzzing with news. The railroad was coming through, maybe not to Red Hollow directly, but close enough to change things. Property values would go up. More people would come. The frontier town that had existed in relative isolation for decades was about to be connected to the wider world. What do you think? Clara asked as they rode back up the mountain. About what? About the changes. About Red Hollow becoming less isolated. Don't affect us much. We're still up here. But it affects the town, the people we know. Mary's kids will grow up with different opportunities. The whole character of the place will change. Is that bad? Clara considered. No, just different. Nothing stays the same forever. You worried about it? A little. I chose this place partly because it was remote, forgotten. If it becomes connected and modern, it might not feel like home anymore. Ethan reached over and took her hand. Home isn't the town, it's the mountain. It's the cabin we built together. That won't change no matter what happens down there. Promise? Promise. But privately, Ethan wondered if he was right. Change had a way of spreading, of touching even things you thought were protected. Still, they'd survived everything else. They'd survived progress, too. The winter of their second year was milder, which meant they could make it down to town more regularly. Clara kept helping Mary with the books, and Ethan started trading more actively with the newcomers the railroad rumors were already attracting. They became less isolated without quite meaning to, their mountain retreat getting woven back into the social fabric of Red Hollow. Some nights Ethan would wake to find Clara sitting at the window, looking out at the dark forest. Can't sleep? He'd ask. Just thinking. About what? About how strange life is. 2 years ago, I was sitting on store steps with nothing, ready to give up. Now I'm here with you, with a home and a future. It doesn't feel real sometimes. It's real. I know. That's what makes it strange. One clear night in January, they stood outside watching stars so bright and numerous they seemed to crush down from above. Clara leaned against Ethan, both of them wrapped in blankets against the cold. I want to tell you something, she said. Something I've never told anyone. All right? When I was sick last year, when I thought I might die, I wasn't scared. Not of dying, anyway. I was scared of not having lived enough, of all the years I wasted being what other people wanted me to be. You're living now. I know, that's what I'm trying to say. These 2 years with you have felt more real, more fully lived than the entire 43 years before them. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. She turned to look at him. You gave me my life back, Ethan. I need you to know that. You gave me mine too. They stood under the stars, two people who'd found each other at the end of their respective roads, and Ethan thought about how close they'd both come to missing this. If Clara had given up one day earlier, if he'd ignored her on those steps, if either of them had been too scared to take the risk, but they hadn't. They'd stumbled toward each other, broken and wary and convinced they were done with hope, and somehow, impossibly, they'd built something that worked. Spring came early that third year, and with it came changes. Mary had her baby, a boy this time, healthy and loud. The railroad company bought land east of Red Hollow and started surveying. 2 new families moved to town, bringing children and optimism, and the particular chaos of people who believed in fresh starts. Clara watched it all with interest, but not longing. She'd go down to town, help Mary, catch up on news, then ride back up the mountain with visible relief. Getting to be too much down there, she said after one trip. Too many people, too much noise. Never thought I'd hear you complain about too many people. I've changed. Or maybe I've just finally become who I actually am instead of who I thought I should be. That summer, Ethan finished building a workshop separate from the cabin. Clara had pointed out that his trapping and leatherwork were taking up too much space inside, and she was right. The workshop gave him room to spread out, to work without worrying about disturbing her. It also gave them both space to be alone when they needed it, which turned out to be important. They'd learned that being together didn't mean being in each other's pocket every moment. Sometimes Clara needed the cabin to herself to write. Sometimes Ethan needed to work in silence without conversation. They'd figured out how to be married without losing themselves in the process. On their second anniversary, they rode down to Red Hollow for supplies and found the town preparing for some kind of celebration. Turned out the railroad was coming through after all, and the first train was expected within the month. Everyone was excited about the opportunities, the connection to the wider world. Things are really changing, Clara observed, watching people hang bunting on buildings. Yeah. You worried? Not really. Change happens whether you worry about it or not. Very philosophical. I'm becoming wise in my old age, Clara laughed. You're 43, not ancient. Feel ancient sometimes. That's because you insist on chopping all that firewood yourself instead of letting me help. You help plenty. They loaded their supplies and headed back up, and halfway there Clara said, I'm glad we live where we do, up above all the changes and chaos, our own little world. It won't stay isolated forever. Progress reaches everywhere eventually. I know. But by the time it reaches us, we'll have had these years. These perfect, difficult, impossible years where it was just us figuring things out. Ethan understood what she meant. They'd needed this time, this isolation, to build something strong enough to withstand whatever came next. If they'd tried to do this in town, surrounded by opinions and expectations, they might not have made it. That fall brought the first frost early, and with it came a visitor. A man on a tired horse, dressed too well for the frontier, asking directions to Thompson Ridge. Ethan was in town when the man arrived, and Mary sent her oldest running to find him. Says he's looking for Clara Voss, the boy panted. Says it's important family business. Ethan felt ice in his stomach. Clara's past, which had seemed safely distant, suddenly felt very close. He found the man at the cafe, drinking coffee and looking out of place among the rough mountain folk. I'm Ethan Crowley, Clara's husband. What's this about? The man stood, offered his hand. Thomas Brennan, attorney from Boston. I've been trying to locate Mrs. Voss, or I suppose it's Mrs. Crowley now, for several months. Why? Her husband has died, the one who abandoned her, and it turns out he left behind a rather complicated estate. Ethan's mind raced. What kind of estate? The kind that includes property, investments, and a fair amount of debt. Mrs. Crowley is listed as his legal spouse, which makes her responsible for sorting it out. She divorced him. Did she? Because I can find no legal record of divorce proceedings, which means legally she's his widow. Ethan didn't ride up to the cabin immediately. He needed time to think, to figure out how to tell Clara that her past had found her after all, that the man who destroyed her life once was reaching back from the grave to complicate it again. When he finally made the ride up, it was nearly dark. Clara was outside feeding the goats, and she looked up with a smile that faded when she saw his face. What's wrong? We need to talk. Inside, he told her everything, watched her face go through shock, anger, confusion, settling finally on a kind of weary resignation. Of course, she said when he finished. Of course he couldn't just stay gone. Had to cause problems even dead. You don't have to deal with it. We could tell the lawyer we're not interested. It's not that simple. If there's debt in my name, creditors could come after me, after us. She sat down heavily. I have to go back, don't I? To Boston. To sort it out. I'll go with you. Ethan, it could take months. You can't leave the mountain that long. The hell I can't. You think I'm letting you face this alone? Clara looked at him with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. I don't want to go back there. I don't want to see that city, that life. I'm done with all of it. Then we'll make it quick. Go, sort out the legal mess, come home. What if it's not quick? What if it drags on and we're stuck there? Then we're stuck there together. Clara, I meant what I said when I married you, for better or worse. This is worse. I'm not backing out now. She broke then, tears spilling over, and Ethan held her while she cried. All the strength she'd built up, all the distance she'd put between herself and her old life, threatened by a dead man who couldn't leave well enough alone. They spent a week preparing, found someone to watch the cabin and the animals, packed what they'd need for an extended absence, said awkward goodbyes to Mary and the few others they'd gotten close to. The train ride east was Clara's first time on the railroad, and she spent most of it pressed against the window, watching the country change from mountains to plains to cities. Ethan watched her watch the landscape, seeing her retreat into herself as they got closer to Boston. The city was everything Ethan had expected to hate. Crowded, dirty, loud, full of people rushing everywhere like they were being chased. Clara moved through it like a ghost, showing him the streets where she'd lived, the houses where she'd attended parties, the church where she'd married a man who would eventually destroy her. The legal process was worse than they'd feared. Clara's husband had left behind a tangle of debts and disputed property, and sorting it required lawyers and court appearances and endless paperwork. Weeks turned into months. Fall became winter. They rented a small room near the courthouse and fell into a routine that felt nothing like their mountain life. Ethan hated every minute of it. Hated the city, the crowds, the way Clara's shoulders hunched when she walked down the street like she was trying to make herself smaller. Hated watching her become someone different, harder and more defensive than the woman he'd married. "We should go home," he said one night in February. "Just leave. Let the lawyers sort it out. They need me here. I have to testify, sign things. They can send papers. We can handle it from Red Hollow. Ethan, there's a court date next month. If I don't show up, I could lose everything." "What everything? We don't need whatever he left behind." Clara looked at him with exhausted eyes. "It's not about needing it. It's about making sure it's settled, making sure no one can ever come after me again for his debts." So they stayed, endured another month of lawyers and paperwork and city living that made them both miserable. The court date came and went. The judge ruled in Clara's favor. She wasn't responsible for debts incurred after her husband abandoned her, but she was entitled to whatever remained of his estate once those debts were paid, which turned out to be almost nothing. A few $100s after everything was settled, barely worth the months they'd spent fighting for it. "We could have lived on the mountain for 6 months," Clara said bitterly as they left the courthouse for the last time. "Instead, we wasted all this time here. It's done now. We can go home." "Can we? What if there's another complication, another legal issue?" "Then we'll handle it from home. I'm done with this city, Clara. I need mountains and quiet and a life that makes sense." That night she packed their few belongings with shaking hands. "I hate that he did this, that even dead, he still has power over my life. He doesn't, not anymore. We're leaving. We're going home. He can't touch us there." They caught the first train west the next morning. Clara spent the entire journey with her forehead pressed against the window, not speaking, just watching civilization fall away behind them. When the mountains finally came into view, she started crying. "Almost there," Ethan said, taking her hand. "I know. That's why I'm crying. I'm so relieved I could scream." Red Hollow looked the same, which was somehow surprising. They'd been gone 4 months, long enough for everything to feel different, but the town had just kept existing without them. The railroad had come through, bringing changes Ethan barely registered. All he cared about was getting back up the mountain. They rode up in the evening, both of them silent with anticipation. When the cabin came into view, Clara made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Home," she said. "Home," Ethan agreed. Inside, everything was as they'd left it. A little dusty, a little cold, but intact. Their neighbor had kept his word, fed the animals, and maintained the basics. Clara walked through like she was seeing it for the first time, touching surfaces, checking that everything was real. "I was so scared it wouldn't feel like home anymore," she said. "That going back to Boston would ruin this somehow." "Did it?" "No. If anything, it made me love it more. Made me understand what I have here." She turned to face him. "I'm never leaving again. I don't care what legal issues come up or what the lawyers say. This is where I belong." "What about the money from the estate?" "What money? $300? We'll put it toward improving the homestead. Maybe buy more livestock. But I don't want it for myself. Don't even want to think about where it came from." They spent that night putting the cabin back in order, rebuilding the fire, making everything feel lived in again. And when they finally fell into bed, exhausted and relieved, Clara said something she hadn't said in months. "I'm happy." "Yeah?" "Completely, totally. Impossibly happy to be home with you in this tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere." She laughed. "My mother would have been horrified. But I don't care. This is my life, and I finally got it right." Spring came late that year, but when it arrived with force. Snow melted in rushing streams, flowers burst from frozen ground, and the whole mountain seemed to shake off winter like a dog shaking off water. Clara threw herself into the homestead with renewed energy, used the estate money to buy sheep, started a bigger garden, talked about maybe trying to grow some kind of cash crop they could sell in town. She was building not just a home, but a legacy, something that would outlast them both. Ethan watched her transform from the broken woman he'd met on store steps into someone who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. It wasn't always easy. She still had days where the isolation got to her, where the work seemed endless and pointless. But those days were fewer now, and she'd learned to push through them. On a warm day in May, they were working in the garden when Clara stopped and sat back on her heels. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. That first day, when you offered to buy me something, I lied about why I laughed. I know, you told me. You were considering walking into the wilderness. That's part of it, but there's more." She pulled off her gloves, twisted them in her hands. "I laughed because the whole situation was so absurd it broke something in me. This rough mountain man offering to help a stranger, completely sincere, no ulterior motive. It was so different from every other man I'd known that I couldn't process it. So I laughed. Okay. But what I didn't tell you was that in that moment, I made a decision. If the world could still produce people like you, people who offered kindness without expecting anything in return, then maybe it was worth sticking around to see what else was possible." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "So I saved your life." "You did, completely and totally. And then you kept saving it every day after, just by being exactly who you are." Clara stood up, came to kneel beside him. "I don't say it enough, but I need you to know. You gave me a reason to keep going when I had none. You gave me a home when I was homeless. You gave me a future when I thought mine was over. You gave me the same things. I know. That's what makes this work. We saved each other." She kissed him, dirt-stained and sweaty and completely perfect. "Thank you for seeing me that day. For not just walking past like I was invisible. Couldn't walk past you if I tried. Something about you grabbed me and wouldn't let go. Good. Because I'm never letting you go either." They went back to their gardening, side by side in the mountain soil, building something that would grow and sustain them through whatever seasons came next. The sun was warm on their backs, the air smelled like pine and fresh earth, and in the distance, Red Hollow continued its slow transformation into something new. But up on Thompson Ridge, time moved differently. Up there, it was still just Ethan and Clara, two people who'd found each other at the end of their roads and decided to build a new path together. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. Some days they fought like they hated each other, and some days they could barely stand to be in the same room, but they stayed. Through hard winters and disappointing harvests, through sickness and uncertainty, through all the small and large disasters that make up a life. They stayed, and they built, and slowly, so slowly they barely noticed it happening, they became the thing neither had believed possible anymore. They became happy. Not the bright, simple happiness of youth, but the deep, complicated happiness of people who'd earned it through struggle and compromise and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. The happiness of knowing someone completely and choosing them anyway. The happiness of a home built by two sets of hands, a life created from nothing but hope and hard work. Years later, when people would ask Clara about that first day, about why she'd laughed at Ethan's offer, she'd tell them a simplified version of the truth. She'd talk about absurdity and timing and how strange life could be. But the real truth, the one she kept close, was simpler and more profound. She'd laughed because for the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen a person worth caring about. Someone had offered kindness when she had nothing to offer in return. Someone had reminded her that she was still alive, still capable of beginning again. And that laughter had broken something open inside her, not the bad kind of break that destroys, but the good kind that lets light in. Everything that came after, the coffee, the cabin, the hard winters and harder conversations, the slow building of a life together, all of it started with that laugh. With the moment when Clara Voss remembered she was still capable of hope. And Ethan Crowley, who'd been hiding on a mountain for 15 years, learned that the greatest risk wasn't opening yourself up to pain. It was closing yourself off from the possibility of joy. Together, on that windswept ridge above Red Hollow, they proved that it's never too late to start over. That broken people can build unbroken lives. That love doesn't erase the past, but it can create a future worth living for. And on quiet evenings, sitting on the porch they'd built together, watching the sun set over the mountains, they'd remember how close they'd both come to missing this. How easily they could have walked past each other, too caught up in their own pain to notice someone else's. But they hadn't. They'd seen each other, truly seen, at a moment when both desperately needed to be seen. And from that moment of recognition, from that unexpected laugh on a cold day in a frontier town, they'd built something neither thought possible. A home, a partnership, a future. and that in the end was more than enough.